Chapter 329. Li Mu looked at Elder Su, and Elder Su also looked at him. The situation was very awkward. In the end, it was Elder Su who broke the awkwardness. He coughed lightly and walked into the courtyard. He said, "I have brought Lord Li's trial letter." Since he did not mention what happened just now, Li Mu naturally would not mention it either. He accepted the trial letter and said, "Thank you, Elder Su." Taoist priest Su Chang said, "In 5 days, when the trial begins, I will inform Lord Li again." Li Mu nodded and said, "Okay." Elder Su cupped his hands and said, "I will take my leave first." Li Mu cupped his hands and returned the greeting. "Take care, Elder Su." After a polite exchange, Elder Su turned and left. In the spiritual snail, the Empress thought for a while and said, "Why don't you capture him and I will teach you how to erase his memory?" Li Mu hurriedly said, "No need, no need." Li Mu represented the Empress in the cooperation with the Fulu school. He could sit down and talk with the Fulu school's headmaster. There was no need to erase Elder Su's memory. Moreover, no one would believe him if he said that he wanted to become the headmaster of the Fulu school with just a little theurgy. In fact, Elder Su who walked out of the small hut really scoffed at Li Mu's words just now. To become the headmaster of the Fulu school, he first had to become a core disciple of the Fulu school. Just this alone was enough to completely block him out. The fastest way to become a core disciple of the Fulu school was to participate in the trial of the Tao of Talismans. He had to defeat thousands of cultivators who were proficient in the Tao of Talismans and win first place in the trial. This was only the first step of his plan. The second step was to cultivate hard and break through to the creation realm. Only then could he become an elder. The third step was to break through to the Dongxian realm from the creation realm. Only then could he become the headmaster. It was easy to go from divine ability to creation. At most, it would take a few decades. Once the magic power was enough, success would follow naturally. However, when the creation realm came to Dongxian, what was tested was one's talent and comprehension. The Fulu school had more than 100 creation elders, but only a few first seats. As for the fourth step, becoming the sect master, he still had to break through to the 7th realm and wait for the current sect master to abdicate before he could succeed the position of sect master. Even if there was such a day, it would be decades or centuries later. By then, the great Zhou might have had several emperors. Elder Su just smiled lightly before tossing this matter to the back of his mind, and then he flew towards the main peak. The Tao of Talismans trial this time was presided over by him, and he still had many things to do. Inside the small building, the Empress was silent for a while, then said, "I'm sorry, I misunderstood you just now." Although Li Mu was disappointed by the Empress's lack of trust, he did not show it. He said, "It is okay. I can understand, Your Majesty." As a man, he should be more magnanimous. If he was petty and got angry with the Empress, wouldn't he be like some unreasonable woman? Li Mu tried not to let himself be in the position of a barbaric boyfriend. He was already so magnanimous. He wouldn't have those strange dreams of lying in the Empress's arms at night, right? The next morning, Li Mu sat up from the bed with an expression of doubt on his face. Last night, he was not in the Empress's arms. But the Empress was in his arms. These days, the number of times he dreamed of the Empress was more than the number of times he dreamed of Lu Hanyan. It must be because they talked too often. Li Si said that between men and women, only by maintaining a distance could there be pure friendship. Once the contact became frequent or the distance between them became close, the pure feelings would often become no longer pure. Li Mu decided to reduce the frequency of contact with the Empress, from once a day to once every 2 days. Now that he was far away in the North County, the Empress could not see him. When he returned to Chengdu, if he had such strange dreams again and was caught by the Empress, Li Mu could not even imagine the consequences. There were still a few days before the trial. He borrowed a few talisman books from Elder Su and prepared to make a breakthrough. Although Li Mu had already thoroughly grasped nearly 100 types of basic talismans in the past half a month, among the thousands of cultivators that had participated in the trial, besides a small portion that had come to make up the numbers and gain experience. All of them had absolute confidence in their own Dao of talismans, so Li Mu had no choice but to treat his opponent as a human. 5 days later, on Mount Baiyun, the Talisman Dao trial that was held once every 4 years was about to begin. The Talisman Dao trial was not only a big deal for Mount Baiyun, but also for the entire North County and the surrounding counties. Before and after the Talisman Dao trial, thousands of cultivators gathered near Mount Baiyun. The demons around the North County had to stay in their nests obediently to avoid unexpected disasters. During this period, even demons and ghosts who had not done anything evil could be killed by the cultivators. The Fulu School's Talisman Dao trial was even crueler than the Great Zhou Court's imperial examinations. The imperial examinations selected 100 out of thousands of people. The Talisman Dao trial often had tens of thousands of participants, but in the end, only less than 50 people could pass the trial. It was difficult to select 1 out of 100 people. Even so, there were still countless cultivators who took part in the trial. There was no other reason. The Fulu school was one of the 6 Daoist sections. The sect was rich in resources and had many powerful cultivators. Joining the Fulu school meant that one would take a supreme shortcut on the path of cultivation in the future. The path of cultivation was a competition of resources. All cultivators wanted to rely on a big tree. The Fulu school was a big tree that attracted not only the 36 counties of the Great Zhou, but also cultivators from other countries. There were more than 6,000 cultivators participating in the Talisman Dao trial this time, more than the imperial examinations in the Great Zhou. It was also the first time that Li Mu saw the foundation of one of the 6 Daoist sections. It was the first time that he saw more than 6,000 cultivators gathered together in front of a cliff on a mountain peak in the Baiyun mountain range. Li Mu stood in the crowd. In front of the crowd was a cliff. In front of the cliff, clouds curled more than 100 feet. Behind the cliff was another cliff. He could vaguely see Fulu papers fluttering in the wind under the opposite cliff. With the sound of a bell, everyone walked towards the opposite cliff. Most people stepped on the clouds and walked through the cliff safely. There were also a few who stepped into the air and fell off the cliff. Then, they were wrapped in a white cloud and sent down the mountain. Li Mu had a detailed understanding of the Talisman Dao trial and knew that this was the preparation before the trial. The Fulu school had an age requirement for the cultivators who participated in the trial. Only cultivators below the age of 30 were qualified to participate in the trial. There were many cultivators who participated in the trial every time. Naturally, there would be some who tried to take advantage of the situation by lying about their age to obtain the trial invitation. The Talisman Puppet sect would not spend the effort to check if they were lying before the trial. As long as they walked through this cliff once, it would be obvious who was lying about their age in an attempt to get through. There were Fulu papers on both sides of the cliff. If one's bone age was below the age of 30, they could walk through the cliff safely as if it was flat ground. If one's bone age was above the age of 30, they would fall down as soon as they stepped on the cliff. Then, they would be wrapped in a white cloud and sent down the mountain. Most of the people who participated in the trial walked through safely. Only a few screamed and fell off the cliff. When another group of people saw this, they stood in front of the cliff and began to watch anxiously. Beside the cliff, a young man looked at a muscular man with a big beard and mocked, "Do you think others are blind? You didn't even shave your beard and you want to take advantage of the situation?" The muscular man glanced at him and said in a hoarse voice, "Can't I look old? I'm only 18 today." He snorted coldly and strode into the cliff. Stepping on the white cloud, he safely walked to the other side. The young man's eyes widened. He wondered if the cliff really judged one's bone age. He tentatively took a step forward and after letting out a scream, he fell straight down. These shrill cries caused some people to completely panic, and they didn't dare take another step forward. They turned back along the path they came from with dejection. Li Mu took a step forward and stepped on the white cloud. It was as if he had stepped on solid ground. He easily walked to the other side of the cliff. When he reached the other side, Li Mu realized that this was a huge platform. The platform covered an unknown amount of land. He could not see the end of it. It was as if someone had used great magic to flatten the entire mountain from the mountainside and carve out a platform. On the platform, there were countless stone platforms that were half the height of a person. On the stone platforms, there were writing brushes, yellow paper, cinnabar, and other items. Limu walked to the front and found a stone platform. He stood behind the stone platform. The cultivators who passed the cliff quickly found a stone platform and stood still. They were ready to take the first stage of the Talisman Dao trial. At first, there were more than 6,000 people who had a trial letter. Among them, there were only about 100 people who were over the age and wanted to take advantage of the situation. They had already been eliminated at the cliff. There were still nearly 6,000 people who participated in the first stage of the trial. After everyone who passed the cliff found a stone platform and stood still, 3 shining golden words suddenly appeared in the sky in front of the platform. Exorcism Talisman. There was no explanation for this stage. However, from the words in the sky and the items on the stone platforms, it was not difficult to guess that the first stage of the trial was for everyone to draw an exorcism talisman. The exorcism talisman was a yellow-grade fulu. It was also one of the most basic fulu. It had many uses. When ordinary people carried it on their bodies, low-level ghosts and monsters would not dare to come close. When the exorcism talisman was turned into talisman water and drank it, it could cure common colds and various diseases. Almost all cultivators who had learned fulu knew how to draw an exorcism talisman. For many people, this was the first fulu that they had learned. Fulu school was quite friendly to these cultivators. They did not make things difficult for them in the first stage. However, this did not mean that this stage was not difficult at all. There were only 3 sheets of yellow paper on the stone platform. The amount of cinnabar was only enough to draw 3 fulu. There was an incense stick on the stone platform. At a certain moment, it lit itself. This meant that all the cultivators had to successfully draw an exorcism talisman within the time it took for an incense stick to burn. Moreover, they only had 3 chances. After failing 3 times, they would not have the materials to draw a talisman, cultivators being able to draw a fulu and cultivators being able to draw a fulu in one try were 2 completely different concepts. Some people could draw an exorcism talisman, but they had to fail multiple times and waste many sets of materials before succeeding. Such a person could not be considered to have fulu talent. White Cloud Mountain. Main Peak. There was a huge screen in the sky above the square. On the screen was the situation on the platform. The elders chatted and laughed as they watched the situation on the screen. How long do you think it will take for these people to successfully draw an exorcism talisman? Those who pass will be able to draw it in half an incense stick's time. After that, even if they can draw it, they will not be able to pass the subsequent trials. I remember that in the past trials, the fastest person to draw this talisman took 20 breaths. It was 12 years ago, right? I still remember that Li Er. He was a true talisman Dao genius. 20 breaths. Many elders in the sect can't do it that fast. As the elders were discussing, a beam of light suddenly lit up on the screen. The square fell silent for a moment before an uproar broke out. Someone finished drawing so quickly? How many breaths have passed this time? Less than 10 breaths. That's way too fast. How is that possible? Could there be a 6th realm cultivator among the cultivators? Is that a senior joking? Everyone looked at the screen, which quickly zoomed in on a certain spot on the platform. The elders widened their eyes, wanting to see who could draw an exorcism talisman in such a short time. However, all they saw was a cloud of fog. Everyone could not help but be stunned. What's going on? Why is there fog on the trial platform? Who can go and see what's happening on the trial platform? Someone reacted quickly and said, that's not fog on the trial platform. He has a Dharma treasure on him that conceals heavenly secrets. Elder Su stood up abruptly with a stunned expression. It's him. Chapter 330. On the main peak square, the group of elders looked at the figure shrouded in clouds on the trial platform through the image above, their faces filled with shock. Although the exorcism talisman was the most basic Fulu, even they would need 10 or even 20 breaths to complete it. The success of the talisman was mainly related to two factors. First, whether or not the talisman could be drawn in one go. Second, whether or not the talisman was stable in the process of drawing. It was not easy to draw the Fulu in one go without any ripples in the talisman. One had to ensure the calmness of the heart. If the talisman was slightly impatient, the talisman would be wrong, or the talisman would be too unstable, and the talisman would fail. If the talisman failed, not only would it waste time and energy, it would also waste precious materials. Therefore, in the process of talisman drawing, cultivators would try their best to remain calm and write at a steady pace, ensuring that the talisman was complete and the talisman was stable. Naturally, the talisman drawing speed would not be too fast. To be able to draw the exorcism talisman in 10 breaths, one had to have a high level of cultivation, and one's control of the body and the talisman had reached the peak. Or one had practiced the exorcism talisman for tens of thousands of times. Even if one was in the soul refining stage, they would still be able to draw the talisman quickly and accurately. But generally speaking, no one would spend so much time and energy on a low-level Fulu. Regardless of the reason, the fact that this person could complete the first stage of the trial in 10 breaths was enough to attract their attention. Unfortunately, this person was shrouded in clouds, preventing them from seeing his true appearance. One of the main peak elders looked at Elder Su and asked, "Senior Su, this person, could it be?" Elder Su had already come back to his senses. He nodded and said, "Other than him, who else could it be?" On the trial platform, Li Mu finished the last stroke of the exorcism talisman. The stone platform in front of him suddenly lit up. Beside him, a cultivator who was at the critical moment of drawing the talisman was shocked by this abnormality. His hand trembled, and the talisman was crooked. The first talisman paper was ruined. The cultivator looked down at the ruined talisman paper and blurted out, "Motherf asterisk cur." The stone platform lit up, indicating that the person beside him had successfully completed the Fulu. After that person cursed in his heart, he looked at the young man behind the stone platform with a shocked expression and said in his heart, "How could he be so fast?" He looked at the burning incense in front of the stone platform and didn't dare to think any further. He had already wasted a chance and only had 2 talisman papers left. If he couldn't draw an exorcism talisman before the incense burned out, he would be eliminated in the first stage of the trial. He looked at the man one last time and thought to himself, "I hope you can be as fast in bed." Dozens of breaths after Li Mu drew the exorcism talisman, a faint light began to shine from the trial platform. He looked around. A small number of people had already completed their exorcism talismans, but most of them were still immersed in drawing. Fulu School's first trial was quite interesting. What they tested was the most common Fulu, but the testing method was not ordinary. 1 incense stick and 3 talisman papers. Not only did it require the success rate of the talisman writing, it also required the speed of the talisman writing. For a cultivator who practiced the Tao of Fulu, the success rate of the talisman writing was extremely important. This point was not reflected in low-level Fulu. If the success rate was slightly lower, at most some yellow paper and cinnabar would be wasted. But for high-level Fulu, the talisman papers and talisman writing materials were extremely precious and could not be wasted. If one failed a few times, they might have to gather materials again. Li Mu stood behind the stone platform and waited until the last incense stick on the stone platform burned to ashes. "Wait, I'm just short of 1, give me another 10 breaths, give me a chance." The cultivators who had not yet succeeded in drawing talismans all spoke out anxiously. But the stone platform beside them suddenly burst out with a burst of light and swept them away from the trial platform. The stone platform in front of the cultivators who passed the first stage emitted a faint light, and they continued to stay on the trial platform. Li Mu looked around again and found that after the first stage, the number of cultivators on the stone platform had decreased by nearly half. An ordinary exorcism talisman was also able to distinguish so many cultivators. After the bell rang, Elder Su's voice rang in everyone's ears. Those who can draw 10 exorcism talismans within an hour can enter the 3rd stage of the trial. As his voice fell, Countless yellow papers and cinnabar flew in from outside the platform and landed on the remaining stone platforms. Limu counted the yellow papers on the stone platform in front of him. There were exactly 10 of them. This meant that if one wanted to pass the second stage, he had to ensure a 100% success rate and complete it within an hour. If the difficulty of the first stage was 1, then the difficulty of the second stage was 100. Within the time it took for an incense stick to burn, there were 3 chances to draw an exorcism talisman. If one had some attainments in the Tao of talismans, they could do it. But to ensure that one could draw 10 talismans without making a single mistake was not something a beginner in the Tao of talismans could do. Second, his cultivation wasn't high, but he spent a large amount of time practicing the exorcism talisman. Practice makes perfect, and after practicing thousands of times, he could still draw it so skillfully and accurately. But such actions were meaningless. The exorcism talisman was useful to mortals, but it was useless to cultivators. A cultivator with a normal mind wouldn't waste time on it. Maybe this person just wanted to attract everyone's attention in the first 2 stages of the trial. However, the elders in front didn't think so. One of the elders looked at Elder Su and asked, "Senior Su, what do you think?" Elder Su recalled the scene just now and said, his movements of drawing the exorcism talisman were smooth, and he succeeded in drawing the exorcism talisman in one go. This means that his dermic energy is very stable. There were no gaps between the 10 Fulu talismans, which means that he had a card up his sleeve. If it was him, he definitely wouldn't just be proficient in the exorcism talisman. That elder looked at the fog in the image and said, his basic skills are very solid, and it's rare among the core disciples. I just don't know if he can pass the 3rd stage. The next stage is testing talent, and not basic skills. It was exceptionally quiet on the trial platform. After Limu finished drawing the 10 exorcism talismans, he observed the surrounding cultivators. It was quiet all around, and no strange sounds could be heard. The first 2 stages of the Fulu school's assessment were unusually fair. They didn't differentiate the cultivators based on their cultivation level. They tested the low-grade yellow-level exorcism talisman, the most basic Fulu talisman. Whether it was Dongxian or soul-refining cultivators, they all knew how to draw. No matter how high a grotto profound expert's magic power was, they could only obtain 100 points at most under the situation that the full score was only 100. As for soul-refining cultivators, although their strength was low, as long as they worked hard and performed exceptionally, they could also get the same number of points. Of course, for low-level cultivators, it was definitely more difficult to pass the trial. They were allowed to make mistakes in the first stage, but in the second stage, they couldn't make even the slightest mistake. For this reason, almost all of the cultivators temporarily shut off their hearing to avoid being disturbed by the outside world when they were drawing the exorcism talisman. Sometimes, there would be a mistake, and after a sigh, they would be silently taken away by the stone platform. As time passed, the number of cultivators on the trial platform decreased. In this trial, they couldn't rush it, but they couldn't be unhurried either. Drawing the exorcism talisman required a calm mind. Once rushed, it was easy to make a mistake, and one mistake would waste all of their previous efforts. Furthermore, there was a time limit for this stage. If they were calm and slow, it would increase their success rate, but if they exceeded the time limit of 2 hours, they would still be eliminated. There were constantly cultivators making mistakes and being taken away by the stone platform. This made the remaining cultivators even more careful. They didn't dare to try to be fast, and hoped that time would pass slowly. However, the bell for the second stage of the trial still rang on time. Countless stone platforms emitted a burst of light, sweeping away the cultivators who didn't complete the trial on time. There were less than 1,000 cultivators left on the platform. In the second stage of the trial, 2/3 of the cultivators who passed the previous stage were directly eliminated. In just 2 rounds, 5 out of 6 people were eliminated. The trial of the Fulu school was even crueler than the imperial court's imperial examinations. Limu didn't have to wait long before another golden light lit up the sky in front of him. Chapter 331. The third round of the Talisman Dao trial had begun. Several golden runes appeared in the sky in front of the trial platform. These runes formed a fulu. The moment he saw the rune, Li Mu had some doubts in his heart. Because he had never seen this fulu before. Li Mu had already learned all the basic fulu during his time at fulu school. He was sure that this fulu was not any type that he had seen before. The other trial takers on the other platforms also had stunned expressions on their faces. What rune is this? Why have I never seen it before? How do you draw a fulu that you have never seen before? At this moment, Elder Su's voice was heard. Those who successfully draw this rune within 4 hours will pass the third round and enter the final round of the trial. Countless talisman papers and cinnabar flew in from outside the platform. This time, there were 100 talisman papers. The talisman Dao trial this time seemed to be different from the previous ones. Li Mu looked up at the golden runes above and somewhat understood the Fulu school's purpose. The first 2 rounds tested the trial taker's basic skills. The third round tested the trial taker's talent. Those common Fulu, even those without talent, could be drawn skillfully after thousands of practice over a long period of time. Passing the first 2 rounds only meant that they had a solid foundation in the exorcism talisman. It did not mean anything. But for a new Fulu, the result was different. Those with outstanding talent in the talisman Dao might be able to grasp it in a few hours. Those with average talent would need a few days, or even 10 days to half a month. This Fulu was not in the talisman books that Li Mu had seen before. It should be a new Fulu created by the Fulu school. He had never seen a Fulu before. He did not know the order of writing the runes or the strength of his dermic powers when writing the runes. He had to test them one by one. Li Mu picked up the brush and dipped it in cinnabar. He closed his eyes and pondered for a while before starting to write. He finished drawing the runes in one go, but his magic power was not sealed in the rune paper. This meant that he had failed. I can't inject my magic power. The order of the runes is wrong. Li Mu thought for a moment and picked up the brush again. He changed the order of writing the runes, but he still couldn't seal the magic power. Li Mu lowered his head and looked at the ruined talisman paper. He thought to himself, during the last 2 strokes, the mana leaked out. It's because the mana input was too strong and exceeded the upper limit of this talisman. Again, on the square of the main peak, an elder who had been staring at Li Mu said, "He has already failed twice." Another elder Taoist priest said, "It's normal. A new Fulu, even if you and I have it in our hands, we can't succeed in one try. We have to try many times. However, this talisman is not complicated. If he really has talent in the talisman Dao, 4 hours is enough. After 4 hours, even if he succeeds, his future achievements will be limited." He looked at Elder Su and asked, "Senior Su, do you think he can succeed?" Elder Su shook his head and said, "I don't know. However, if he really wins this trial, there will be a big problem." At this moment, if he still didn't know that Li Mu's, a little, and his understanding of the, a little, were not the same, he would not be qualified to be an elder of the main peak. From the first 2 trials, Li Mu's performance showed that he was definitely not a talisman Dao newbie. And in the 3rd trial, he only failed twice and found the correct order of writing the runes. As long as he tried a few more times, he would be able to find the limit of his dermic powers and successfully write the runes. In this way, he could immediately enter the 4th trial, which was also the last trial. This seemed to be getting closer to his plan of seizing power in the Fulu school. At that time, Elder Su only thought that it was an unrealistic joke. It was not until he saw Li Mu overcome all obstacles in the Talisman Dao trial that a sense of crisis arose in his heart. He couldn't be serious, could he? Just as this concern arose in Elder Su's heart, on the screen above his head, a ray of light swept across. The main peak square was in an uproar. It appeared. Who is so fast? This is the new Fulu that was just designed by the headmaster. No one can know in advance. I can't see his face clearly. Why is it a cloud of fog? Isn't this the person who was the fastest in the 1st and 2nd trials? Li Mu could not hear the discussions of the people in the main peak square. In his 7th trial, he finally succeeded in sealing his dermic powers into the talisman paper and drew the nameless Fulu. Under extreme calmness and without any fluctuations in his heart, drawing talismans was simply successful. He already had some doubts in his heart that in the other world, the art of tranquility did not exist for the purpose of drawing talismans. The moment he finished drawing the Fulu and put down the brush, the stone platform beside him rolled him up and flew off the platform, landing on another mountain peak. The stone platform put him down and returned along the original path. Elder Su stood on the mountain peak and looked at Li Mu with a complicated expression. He cupped his hands and said, "Congratulations, Lord Li, for being the first to complete the first 3 trials." Li Mu cupped his hands and returned the greeting. He said politely, "I was lucky, lucky." He looked at Elder Su and asked, "What is the 4th trial?" Elder Su pointed to the front and said, "This is the 4th trial." Li Mu looked in the direction that he pointed and saw rows of stone steps that extended into the depths of the clouds. Taoist priest Su Chang said, "This 4th trial is both a test for the trial taker and also a creation for the trial taker. As for how much you can benefit from this trial, it depends on the strength of each trial taker," Li Mu said uncertainly. "Creation?" Taoist priest Su Chang said, "You will know when you walk up the stone steps." Li Mu stepped onto the first stone step, and the scenery in front of him suddenly changed. He appeared in a strange world, and when he looked around, all he saw was a vast expanse of whiteness. There was only a table in front of him, and on the table was a piece of paper, a brush, and cinnabar. A familiar Fulu floated in front of the table. It was another exorcism talisman. Clearly, this was another trial for him to draw talismans. Li Mu was about to vomit from drawing exorcism talismans today, but he could only hold back his disgust. He picked up the brush and finished drawing an exorcism talisman in a few breaths. The scenery in front of him disappeared and he returned to the steps again. Li Mu walked to the next step and appeared in the vast expanse of whiteness again. This time, a brand new Fulu appeared in front of him. Demon-seeking talisman. Every step here seemed to correspond to a Fulu. Li Mu finished drawing the demon-seeking talisman. When he walked to the 3rd step, what he saw was the soul fixation talisman. As he guessed, the first trial tested one's basic skills, the 3rd trial tested one's talent, and the 4th trial tested one's basic skills and talent together. There was only one chance for each step. He had to be careful with every step. If he made a mistake in drawing the Fulu, the talisman Dao trial would end here. Even Li Mu did not dare to be careless. He treated the Fulu of each step very seriously. When Li Mu walked to the 10th step, many people had passed the 3rd trial and landed at the foot of the mountain. Some people walked up the steps. After a few steps, their bodies would be teleported out and they would stand at the side with a disappointed expression. Even a talisman Dao expert could not guarantee that he would succeed every time. No matter how careful he was, he still made a mistake on the 6th Fulu. The 4th trial was really too difficult. However, he did not completely give up because others might not do better than him. He still had a chance. He stood at the foot of the mountain and looked at the figure who had walked up more than a dozen steps. A deep sense of powerlessness arose in his heart. Before coming to the Fulu school, he thought that he was a talisman Dao genius. After passing 3 trials in a row, his confidence soared. He thought that if he worked hard, he might have a chance to become a core disciple. However, he suffered a huge blow when he just entered the 4th trial. The figure on the stone steps of the mountain path made him deeply understand the gap between people. Time slowly passed, and more people passed the 3rd stage. 4 hours later, the trial takers who had yet to fully comprehend the talisman on the trial platform had lost their chance to pass the 3rd stage. At this time, there were less than 100 people at the foot of the mountain. The 3rd trial eliminated 90% of the trial takers. Out of the 6,000 people, only 3 trials left 2 digits. Among these people, there were dozens of people who would be eliminated in the 4th trial. They had already learned the rules of the 4th trial from the trial takers who had participated in the 4th trial. They estimated in their hearts which step they could reach. Occasionally, they would look up at the figure at the front and secretly curse him as a monster. On the stone steps, Li Mu had already walked up the 43rd step. This meant that he had drawn 43 Fulu without missing a single detail. He stayed on this step for a full quarter of an hour and did not take another step forward. In the world of cultivation, the Fulu was divided into heaven, earth, Xian, and Huang. Each stage was further divided into upper, middle, and lower grades. There were a total of 4 stages and 12 grades. With Li Mu's current spiritual power, he could only draw a Xian upper grade Fulu. As for the earth lower grade Fulu, he would need to be at least at the 5th level of cultivation to draw one. The last Fulu he drew was a Xian upper grade. The next step would probably be an earth Fulu. With his current spiritual power, it was impossible to draw one. Li Mu looked back and realized that the people below had at most reached the 10th step. It was almost impossible for them to continue to reach the 30th step without making any mistakes. The current him had already won. However, Li Mu still wanted to try. At most, he would fail and be sent down the mountain. But before that, he needed to rest for a while to recover his spiritual power. After drawing more than 40 Fulu in a row, his spiritual power was about to be depleted. Even the donkey in the workshop would not dare to work so hard. If it was not for the fact that he was determined to get that talisman, he would have already given up on the 30th step. The higher the step, the more insurance. He sat cross-legged on the stone step and meditated to recover his spiritual power. After an unknown amount of time, Li Mu suddenly felt movement beside him. He opened his eyes and saw a young man walking to the 43rd step he was on. The young man glanced at him and said, "Hey, make way." Li Mu was shocked. This person was clearly also a cultivator participating in the trial. He actually also reached the 43rd step. Sure enough, he could not underestimate the heroes of the world. No one knew better than him how difficult it was to reach here from the first step. If not for the clear heart mantra, Li Mu would have stopped long ago. That person walked to the middle of the 43rd step and closed his eyes. After 10 breaths, he opened his eyes again. Li Mu narrowed his eyes. He was still standing here and was not sent down. This meant that he had already drawn the 43rd Fulu. That person did not even look at Li Mu and walked to the next step. After a while, he opened his eyes again and stepped onto the 45th step. On the square of the main peak, many disciples and elders had looks of disbelief on their faces. In the past, it was already a surprise to have someone reach the 20th step. This year, someone actually reached the 40th step, and there are 2 of them. Who's the one who caught up from behind? He looks so young, he took less time to reach each step than the first person. I wonder which step he will reach in the end. In the Dao Palace on the main peak, several first seats and the talisman puppet sect leader also had an image in front of them. The image depicted the situation on the stone steps. At this moment, Li Mu, whose entire body was covered in fog, stopped at the 43rd step. That young man had already reached the 47th step. Jianghu looked at the figure at the front and said, "There's something wrong with this person." The Fulu school's first seat looked at the person at the front through the mystic light technique. A golden light flashed in his eyes as he shook his head and said, "Let's not bother about him for now." He looked at Li Mu with admiration and said, "It's Li Mu who really surprised me." Jianghu nodded and said with a strange look in his eyes, "It's not just a surprise. It's simply unbelievable. If I could turn back time, I would kidnap him even if I had to. He has the hope of the Fulu school." Jianghu looked at the person at the front and said, "I wonder who is so bold to come to White Cloud Mountain and cause trouble. Won't this talisman Dao trial become a joke because of him?" The Fulu school's headmaster looked at Li Mu and said with a smile, "That might not be the case." On the 43rd step, Li Mu looked ahead, took a deep breath, and took a step forward. Chapter 332. Taking a step forward, Li Mu once again appeared in that vast white world. The moment he entered, Li Mu's gaze landed on the Fulu floating in front of the table. Then, he sighed softly. This was a purple heaven thunder talisman. As he expected, from the 44th stone step onwards, he would have to write the earth-level Fulu. The Purple Heaven Thunder Talisman was the most common representation of the earth-level Fulu. The Purple Heaven Thunder technique was a 5th-level abhijna. Li Mu could borrow the confrontation technique to release the Purple Heaven Thunder, but with his own mana, he could not directly use it. The Fulu was nothing more than a ceiling of spells. Spells that he could not use naturally could not be made into talismans. Therefore, at present, he could not draw the Purple Heaven Thunder Talisman. The young man in front of him, although he looked like he only had spirit concentration, he must have hidden his cultivation level. However, this was also because his skills were not as good as others. There was nothing to complain about. If he could not pass the trial and get the talisman, he could only swallow his pride and see if he could get one from the Fulu school. Li Mu himself did not have much prestige in the Fulu school, but the Empress did. Using the tiger's skin to pull the banner was his strength. Li Mu cast away these distracting thoughts. Even though he knew it was impossible, he still had to try. If he failed, he would be transported to the lowest stone step like most people. He was about to pick up the talisman pen, but his hands suddenly stopped. The talisman pen on the table seemed to be different from the ones before. Before the 43rd step, he had used a normal talisman pen. The body of the pen was made of wood, and there were runes carved on it. This was to ensure that the cultivator's mana would not destroy the talisman pen when he was using the talisman. At this moment, the talisman pen in his hand seemed to be made of metal but not metal, wood but not wood. Holding it in his hand, it seemed to be weightless. More importantly, after holding the pen, Li Mu had an illusion that the mana in his body seemed to have broken through the bottleneck of the abhijna and reached the creation realm. He looked at the Purple Heaven Thunder Talisman again and saw that the talisman had disappeared. He started to draw again from the beginning. The order of the Purple Heaven Thunder Talisman was gradually imprinted in his mind. Li Mu stared blankly at the strange phenomenon in front of him. It was only now that he understood what Elder Su meant. The 4th stage was both a trial by fire, and also good fortune. With Li Mu's own magic power, he could only reach the 43rd step. The reason why he couldn't move forward wasn't because of his talent or any other reason, but because his cultivation was limited. But from the first 3 trials, the Fulu school did not care about the cultivation of the trial takers. The first and second trials tested the most basic exorcism talisman. The 3rd trial tested the Fulu. Although it was a new Fulu that he had never seen before, the dermic powers required to write it did not exceed the exorcism talisman. In the 4th trial, Li Mu wrote the Fulu. When he reached the limit of his own dermic powers, the rules of the trial seemed to change. He had never drawn the Purple Heaven Thunder Talisman before and did not know the order of the talisman. He also did not have the dermic powers to write the talisman. But in this trial, the Fulu school had given him everything he needed. All he had to do was control his dermic powers and write the talisman step by step. It was probably the same for the cultivators behind him. The Tao of Fulu. Writing the talisman was not difficult, and controlling the dermic powers was not difficult. The difficult part was to smoothly write the talisman while ensuring that the dermic powers of each talisman were stable. The transition of dermic powers between different talismans was a problem of multitasking. The higher the level of the Fulu, the more complex the talisman was. The more dermic powers changed, and the higher the probability of failure. At this time, the use of talent was revealed. Li Mu did not have much talent, but he had a cheat. He held the talisman brush and did not immediately start writing the talisman. Instead, he practiced dozens of times in the void and memorized the talisman characters of the Purple Heaven Thunder Talisman. Then, without using the talisman materials, he felt the process of the dermic powers changing as he wrote the talisman. He repeated this dozens of times before he looked at the talisman paper on the table. He lifted the brush and began to write slowly. At the main peak of Mount Baiyun, in the Dao Palace. Qian Jinko closed his eyes. He also held a talisman brush in his hand. His wrist moved slowly in the void, but it did not seem to be of his own accord. In the art of dark light, Li Mu's body was still covered in a cloud of fog. But if one looked closely at the hand that extended out of the fog, one would realize that his hand and Hyun Jinko's hand moved in the same direction. After a while, Hyun Jinko opened his eyes and said, "The talisman is complete." The Fulu school recruited disciples not based on cultivation, but on talent. In the fourth stage, when the Fulu that the trial taker wrote exceeded the limits of his dermic powers, the peak masters would lend their dermic powers and insights to them. This was also a fortune that the Fulu school gave to the trial takers. They had worked hard to reach the fourth stage. Even if they could not enter the Fulu school in the end, they would still have some insights into the Fulu Dao. Over the millennia, countless people were inspired by this and created new Fulu Dao. They established their own sects outside and became the external branches of the Fulu school. For the ancestral court, the trial of the Tao of Talisman was not only a selection of disciples, but also a way to pass on the Tao. The ancestral court of the Fulu school was established. Apart from strengthening the sect, it also had the heavy responsibility of spreading the Tao of Talisman. The peak master of the Jade Emperor Peak, Jianghu, looked at the scene in the dark light technique and said, "Even if he borrowed your dermic powers and insights, it is still incredible that he could draw the purple sky thunder talisman on his first try." Hyun Jinko's eyes were filled with anticipation. He said, "I wonder what his final step will be." In the white world, Li Mu slowly put away his brush. The Fulu on the table was complete. The scenery in front of him changed again, and he returned to the 44th stone step. The fourth stage of the trial was different from what he had imagined. He did not need to worry about his dermic powers, nor did he need to worry about the order of the talismans. The only thing he needed to do was to maintain an extreme calmness in his heart and write the talisman step by step. In theory, as long as there was no limit to the amount of dermic powers he could use, he could walk as many steps as there were on the stone steps. Li Mu raised his head and took a look. The young man from before had already disappeared beyond the 50th step. However, he was not worried and slowly walked up to the 45th step. In the square in front of the main peak, everyone's gaze was on the two figures left on the stone steps. Apart from these two people, all the other trial challengers had already completed the final trial. The strongest among them had only passed the 15th step. The first person to pass the first three stages, the figure shrouded in fog in the scene, had already reached the 45th step. As for the young man who came later, he was already beyond the 50th step. Not to mention the ordinary disciples, even the elders of the sect were witnessing such a scene for the first time. Once again in this strange world, Li Mu's mood was completely relaxed as he faced the sword talisman. Elder Su was right. The fourth stage of the trial was indeed an opportunity. Shermu didn't have the ability to draw these magic charms by himself. However, he was bound to gain a lot of insights after this experience. So, he could draw these magic charms after his cultivation had advanced. Then, it would be easy for him to do so. Purple Cloud Thunder Talisman, Sword Talisman, Soul Lock Talisman, Frost Talisman, Fire Dragon Talisman. Li Mu walked up the higher step by step. When he looked ahead, the young man's figure could already be seen. A few steps in front of him, the young man looked back. His usually calm face finally showed some seriousness. In the palace of the main peak, several heads and the headmaster of the Fulu school had been silent for a long time. Not long after, Hyun Jinko opened his eyes and said, "A few more steps and it will be the heaven-level Fulu." To draw an earth-level Fulu, one had to be at least in the creation realm. The creation realm referred to the elders of the Fulu school, people who had spent their lives studying the Fulu Dao. Non-cultivators of the Fulu school, even if they were in Dongxian, might not be able to draw an earth-level Fulu. As for the heaven-level Fulu, only the heads of the Fulu school and above could maintain a high success rate. Because the materials for talismans were precious and rare, the entire Fulu school could only produce a few in a year. At this moment, the young man in the first place took another step forward and reached the heaven-level Fulu. Before this, no one had ever reached this step. Jianghu looked at the headmaster of the Fulu school and said, "Senior brother, the heaven-level materials are precious. Should we stop this person?" The headmaster of the Fulu school shook his head and said, if the news of stopping the trial spread, the Fulu school would become a joke in the cultivation world. As soon as he finished speaking, the young man had already stepped onto the next step. This time, he stayed there for almost an hour before he finally opened his eyes. His body was still in place, indicating that he had drawn a Fulu of this step. At the same time, Li Mu had also reached the next step. At this step, the Fulu he had drawn had already reached the high grade of the earth level. One more step and it would be the heaven level Fulu. The young man in front of him had already drawn a heaven level Fulu. If he did not have the same secret as Li Mu, then he must have hidden his cultivation level. His true cultivation level should be above that of Dongxian. The cliff of the first stage of the trial could test one's bone age and filter out the majority of people who wanted to fish in troubled waters. However, it could not do anything to true experts. This person might have come to cause trouble for the Fulu school. For the time being, Li Mu did not know how much courage this person had. He only knew that if he wanted to obtain that one and only talisman, he would have to walk in front of this person. Without hesitation, he lifted his foot and stepped onto the next step. In the strange space, Li Mu's body appeared once again. In the air in front of the table, golden light formed a Fulu. This Fulu was formed from countless complex runes. Even if an ordinary person only glanced at it, they would feel their heads swell. It was no wonder that heaven-level Fulu was so difficult to form into a talisman. Even Dongxian and Transcendence could not guarantee the success rate. These runes were too complex. It was very difficult to guarantee that there would be no mistakes. Even the slightest mistake would cause all the previous efforts to be wasted. The precious materials and the extremely low success rate caused the Fulu school to only produce a few in a year. It was no wonder that when Yuzhen Zi extorted that head, his expression was so pained. For a peak head, this level of Fulu was no different from cutting off his flesh. This time, Li Mu was not in a hurry to draw a talisman. Instead, he looked around and sized up this strange world. As far as his eyes could see, everything was white. At first, Li Mu thought that this was some kind of illusion. Later on, he gradually realized that this should be a flask heaven space. The table in front of him was real. The talisman brush, talisman paper, talisman materials were all real. The Fulu that was drawn was also real. The Fulu school had really invested a lot in this trial. The materials needed to make a heaven-level Fulu talisman liquid were all wasted. It was a great loss. The young man in front of Li Mu had clearly succeeded. If Li Mu wanted to be in the same position as him, he would have to draw this heaven-level Fulu. Li Mu slowly let out a sigh of relief. He chanted the heart-calming mantra again and began to study this Fulu composed of complex talisman characters. 2 hours later, on the 55th stone step, Li Mu slowly opened his eyes. Next to him, the young man did not move forward. Instead, he looked at Li Mu with deep shock in his turbid eyes. With his half-step transcendence cultivation, he still needed to use all his strength and a certain amount of luck to be able to draw a low-grade heaven-level Fulu. How could he not see that this person's true strength was only in his divine arts? Even if he didn't use his magic power or comprehension to draw a talisman, this Fulu was truly drawn by him. A strange light flashed in the young man's eyes. At this moment, the person in front of him gave him the feeling of a 3-year-old child holding a 2-foot-long spear and performing a set of spear techniques that even he felt inferior to. He glanced at Li Mu and walked up the next step. Li Mu observed his back and found that this person's body was between illusory and real. It seemed that his guess was right. What was left behind on the stone steps was only a shadow. His body had entered another space. The fourth trial seemed to be on this mountain peak, but it was actually in the flask heaven space created by the upper realm powerhouses of the Fulu school. Li Mu meditated on the spot. Not long after, the young man's figure on the stone steps in front of him suddenly solidified. In the next moment, his body was teleported out. Obviously, he'd failed in this grade of talisman. The young man appeared below with a gloomy face. He looked up at the remaining figure on the stone steps. There was no one in front of him. Li Mu sighed in relief and slowly stood up. If this person advanced another step, the pressure would be great. If he failed on this step, Li Mu would have to successfully draw the Fulu of the next stone step and successfully obtain the talisman. At this time, in the main peak's palace, several heads finally breathed a sigh of relief. That person has finally failed. How can it be so easy? Even if the head teacher personally makes a move, I'm afraid he can't guarantee it. Li Mu has been at ease all this time. The next Fulu should not be difficult for him. Jianghu was about to pick up the brush when the Fulu school's head teacher suddenly walked to his side and said, "Let me do it." Jianghu smiled and said, "Senior brother, don't worry. I can still help him with the spiritual power and comprehension of the Fulu school." The Fulu school's head teacher looked at him and smiled without saying anything. Jianghu was stunned and said in disbelief, "Senior brother, are you thinking of?" Li Mu stood on the 55th step, guessing in his heart. According to his experience, on the next step he would need to draw a low-grade heaven step Fulu or even a medium-grade heaven step. However, judging from how quickly that young man was eliminated, the latter was more likely. He wasn't worried about this. So long as the talisman brush was able to provide him with sufficient dermic energy, then it wouldn't be a problem even if it was a mid-grade heaven-ranked talisman brush. With that thought in mind, he slowly took a step forward. It was still a familiar space. Li Mu looked at the empty space in front of the table. Amidst the golden light, Li Mu felt a wave of dizziness and took a few steps back. He looked at the extremely complicated rune in front of him and stood there in shock. He thought that a low-grade heaven-ranked Fulu was already complicated enough, but he didn't expect that he was too naive. At this moment, Li Mu felt like he had just learned about multipliers and was asked to solve advanced mathematics problems using integral and differential theory. Chapter 333. Li Mu looked at the mysterious runes in the flask space and was speechless. In the main peak's Daoist palace, the first seats were also shocked by the head teacher's actions. Jianghu said in disbelief, "Senior brother head teacher, isn't the gap too big? In today's cultivation world, including our Fulu school, I've never heard of anyone who could draw a saint-level Fulu." Jade Emperor Peak's first seat Jianghu said, "The saint-level rune liquid is too precious. If it's used to draw a saint-level Fulu, you can draw more than 10 middle-level or upper-level ones." Sangling Peak's first seat Master Ashen Pine hesitated for a moment and also advised, "In the fourth stage of the trial, the Fulu of the same level should be the same. One middle-level heaven level and the other saint level, isn't it a little unfair?" Fulu school's head teacher looked at them with a deep gaze and said, "The middle-level heaven level might not be his limit. I want to take a gamble." They thought for a moment and understood the head teacher's meaning. The person that concealed his identity earlier had already stopped at this level. If Li Mu was able to draw a mid-grade heaven-ranked talisman at this level, then he would be the first in the Tao of Talismans trial this time. People who could draw a middle-level heaven-level Fulu were rare in Fulu school. Other than the head teacher, the 7 first seats only had less than a 10% chance of success. However, although it was rare, it still existed. However, to draw a saint-level Fulu, one's cultivation had to be in the upper realm. In the entire Fulu school, only the head teacher and the 2 grand elders had this kind of power. Moreover, having the power to draw a talisman did not mean that the talisman would succeed. The success rate of drawing a saint-level Fulu talisman was less than 10%. The materials for a saint-level talisman were extremely precious and could not be wasted. The materials used to draw a saint-level Fulu could be used to draw more than 10 heaven-level Fulu. They would usually choose to use them to create a heaven-level talisman. Now, the head teacher was giving the materials that he was reluctant to use to a 4th realm cultivator. Although the first seats were astonished, they didn't say anything. Based on their understanding of the sect leader, if he wasn't certain, he wouldn't take such a risk. He was willing to gamble with Li Mu this time, perhaps because he had already calculated some clues. Everyone looked at the image of the mystic light technique with anticipation. Within the flask space, Li Mu had yet to recover from the shock. No wonder that person failed so quickly. Motherth *Ker, was this talisman drawn by a human? Li Mu even guessed that this Fu Lu was not a middle-grade heaven-class item, but a high-grade one. It was simply something the Fu Lu school used to make things difficult for people. Just looking at the runes gave him a headache, not to mention writing runes. Li Mu wanted to give up at the first moment, but he forced himself to hold back. He could not give up. The person from before had stopped at this stage. If he gave up, he would only be able to fight to a draw with him. It was still unknown who would emerge victorious in the end. However, for Li Qing's sake, he had to get this talisman. Li Mu took a deep breath and endured the dizziness as he looked at the Fu Lu. On the main peak of Mount Baiyun. 3 days had passed. The crowd in the square gathered and dispersed, then gathered again. At this time, there were only a dozen people standing in the square, looking up at the image in the sky. He's been standing there for 3 days. When will it end? If you're not confident, just give up. There's no point in continuing like this. In the image, the figure standing on the stone steps, shrouded in clouds and mist, had been standing there for 3 whole days. This had never happened in the past trials. Everyone on Mount Baiyun was waiting for him alone. Below the stone steps, nearly 100 people sat cross-legged and meditated, occasionally looking up. 3 days was nothing to cultivators. Those who had not walked the stone steps personally did not know how difficult it was to climb each step. They only had respect for those who could reach the 50th step. The young man standing at the bottom of the stone steps had been looking at Li Mu for 3 whole days. There was no anxiety on his face as he looked calmly at Li Mu's back. There was a hint of suspicion in his eyes as he muttered, "It's been 3 days. What the hell is Xian Jizi doing?" According to the rules of the Tao of Talismans trial, a cultivator could stay on every step for a maximum of 6 hours. If he hadn't started writing talismans after 6 hours had passed, then he would be directly teleported to the bottom and the trial would be terminated. However, the junior that he could not see through had been standing on the 56th step for 3 whole days. He could not figure it out. He acknowledged the junior's strength. There was no reason for him to be so careful with a mere heaven-grade golden armor divine army talisman. If he could not draw it, he could not draw it even if he stood there for 3 years, let alone 3 days. If he succeeded, he would have succeeded 3 days ago. If he failed, he would have failed 3 days ago. How could he drag it out until today? Dao Palace of the main peak. Several heads, including the Fu Lu school's headmaster, had not taken a single step out of the palace during these 3 days. In the scene shown by the profound light technique, Li Mu was holding a talisman brush and drawing a certain talisman in the air. He had already drawn it a few thousand times. His face was pale and his aura was weak. His eyes were bloodshot, but his gaze was increasingly confident. At a certain moment, Li Mu sat down cross-legged and closed his eyes. He threw a few pills into his mouth and began to quickly recover his spirit. After a quarter of an hour, he stood up again and walked to the table. There was a talisman paper on the table. This talisman paper was several times larger than an ordinary talisman paper. It was not yellow paper. The talisman paper itself emitted bursts of spiritual energy. It should be made from the wood pulp of some kind of precious tree. At the corner of the table, there was a jade bowl filled with golden talisman liquid. For Fu Lu below the earth stage, one could use cinnabar to draw talismans. For those above the earth stage, one needed a special talisman liquid. This golden talisman liquid emitted a faint fragrance. Li Mu swallowed his saliva and recited the clear heart technique. Only then did he resist the urge to drink it in one gulp. The higher the level of the Fu Lu, the stronger the spiritual energy contained in the spirit liquid. This bowl of spirit liquid was enough to make his body explode. After adjusting his state to its peak, Li Mu picked up the talisman brush and prepared to draw talismans. Because there was only one chance for the trial, he had already practiced the Fu Lu's talisman thousands of times in the past 3 days. He had already memorized it by heart and would not make a mistake. As for spiritual energy, he did not know how this talisman brush worked. It could actually draw on the spiritual energy of the Fu Lu school's experts. Li Mu guessed that the one who provided him with the spiritual energy should be one of the heads. He had never controlled such powerful spiritual energy. It even gave him the illusion that he could fight with the Empress. He had not contacted the Empress for 3 days. In this flask space, the spiritual snail could not send messages. Moreover, there was a live broadcast of the trial using the dark light technique. Li Mu could not chat with the Empress. He cast these thoughts aside. After calming down, he began to focus on drawing talismans. He held the talisman brush, controlled the majestic spiritual energy, and made the first stroke. In the Taoist palace, the heads of the peaks were also extremely focused. In the Tao of Fulu, one must acknowledge the existence of talent. Talent was more important than hard work. This was also the common understanding of everyone. Li Mu's talent in the Tao of talismans was rare in the world. However, what he was drawing now was a saint-level Fulu. There were originally 6 levels of Fulu. People only knew about the heaven, earth, black, and yellow, but not the divine. This was because the last 2 levels of Fulu were rarely seen. The Fulu school had saint-level Fulu, but that was left behind by the sect's seniors hundreds of years ago. In these hundreds of years, countless experts in the Fulu school had not been able to draw a single saint-level Fulu. Could this young man in the drawing possibly add a saint-level Fulu to the Fulu school? In the flask space, Li Mu was fully focused on drawing. Although this Fulu was complicated, after 3 days of practice, he was already very familiar with it. He had even developed muscle memory. With his eyes closed and without thinking, he could draw it out instinctively. Of course, he was not so careless. There was only one chance. If he made a mistake, he would have to fight an extra round with that unidentified young man. His opponent was most likely an old monster. This was Li Mu's only chance. Li Mu concentrated, seriously writing the runes and carefully controlling his spiritual energy. This was very taxing on his mind. Li Mu's face was pale, and his clothes were soaked in sweat. However, he still gritted his teeth and persevered. When he reached the last stroke of the last rune, Li Mu held his breath and focused, gently placing the brush down. The talisman paper was unharmed, the brush was unharmed, and his spiritual energy did not leak out. It was all sealed in the Fulu. Puff! Li Mu spat out a mouthful of blood and collapsed to the ground. This was caused by overdrawing his mind for a long time. The exhaustion of this Fulu on his mind was far beyond his imagination. His figure flashed, and he fell on the stone steps. He's out. He's finally out. He wasn't teleported, he succeeded. 3 days, 3 whole days. What kind of Fulu did he draw? On the main peak square, below the stone steps, countless people exclaimed. The 3 days of waiting had finally come to an end. However, before they could say anything, they seemed to sense something and looked up at the sky. The White Cloud Mountain was the ancestral court of the Talisman sect. The weather was as clear as day for hundreds of years, and every day was a beautiful day. However, today, thick dark clouds suddenly gathered in the sky. The dark clouds gathered at an extremely fast speed. In a few breaths, they occupied the entire sky above everyone's heads. In the dark clouds, lightning snakes danced wildly like giant dragons. Under the dark clouds, whether it was the disciples of White Cloud Mountain or the trial takers, they all felt as if a huge rock was pressing down on their hearts, making it difficult for them to breathe. Everyone's faces were filled with horror. This was a scene they had never seen before in their lives. Below the stone steps, the young man's expression changed greatly after a short moment of shock. He said in shock, "Heavenly tribulation, this is the heavenly tribulation of a saint-level Fulu. A saint-level Fulu has descended." As if realizing something, he suddenly turned his head and looked at Li Mu, who was above the stone steps. Could it be that he had been drawing a saint-level Fulu for the past 3 days? Li Mu sat on the stone steps and looked at the dark clouds in the sky, as well as the lightning dragons that were so thick that they made people tremble. He suddenly had an illusion. This thing seemed to be coming for him. If he was struck by this several feet thick lightning, no, even if it was just a graze, he would end up like Zhou Chu, or even worse than Zhou Chu, just as this thought appeared in Limu's mind, he saw several auras rising into the sky from the main peak. At the same time, the Dao bell buzzed and flew into the sky. In the blink of an eye, it became hundreds and thousands of times bigger, completely enveloping the entire White Cloud Mountain. Chapter 334. The Dao bell covered the sky and completely enveloped White Cloud Mountain. On White Cloud Mountain, the disciples and trial takers looked up and saw a huge illusory and transparent bell shadow. Although there was a long crack on the bell shadow, it still gave the disciples of White Cloud Mountain an incomparable sense of security. Outside the Law Bell were dark clouds that were so low that one would feel suffocated just by looking at them. Lightning danced wildly in the dark clouds. Some were as thin as pythons, while others were as thick as dragons. They constantly swam in the dark clouds and eventually poured down on White Cloud Mountain. Countless bolts of lightning enveloped White Cloud Mountain as if it was the end of the world. When the lightning landed on the Dao bell, it was completely absorbed. The Dao bell's shadow became even more illusory, but it still firmly enveloped White Cloud Mountain. The few figures that rushed into the sky were the F. Lu School's headmaster and the 5 first seats. After releasing the first wave of lightning, more lightning began to brew in the dark clouds. The F. Lu School's headmaster and the 5 first seats flew into the dark clouds. They heard continuous rumbling sounds coming from the dark clouds, revealing a rainbow-colored Dharma spell light. The lightning in the dark clouds became fewer and fewer. Limu sat on the stone steps below and looked up at the strange phenomenon in the sky. The more he thought about it, the more he felt that something was amiss. The Talisman Sutra mentioned that the F. Lu of the world was divided into 6 grades. Yellow, Mystic, Earth, and Heaven. Above them were Saint level and Divine level. Most cultivators only knew about Heaven, Earth, Mystic, and Yellow because the first 4 grades were the most common. This was the best explanation based on the ability of writing talismans and the ability to conserve materials. The difficulty of inscribing talismans increased exponentially with each rank. For yellow rank talismans, once low-level cultivators familiarized themselves with them, they would be able to complete 100% of the talismans. As long as they had enough yellow paper and cinnabar, they would be able to inscribe yellow rank talismans. However, even a transcendent expert couldn't guarantee a success rate for Heaven-level F. Lu. The success rate for Saint-level F. Lu was so low that the materials for writing talismans were basically given for free. After diluting materials of that grade, one could successfully draw more than 10 Heaven-level F. Lu. No sect could afford to waste them. Limu had only seen a few Heaven-ranked Fu Lu talismans. Talisman books would not have this kind of high-level Fu Lu. This was the core secret of the Fu Lu school, but he had a golden armor talisman in his hand. Previously, Limu had wholeheartedly wanted to win the trial, so he didn't have any distracting thoughts. But now that he thought about it, the complexity of the golden armor divine army seal couldn't be compared to the one he had just drawn. In front of the Fu Lu he drew, the golden armor talisman was like a little brother. When Limu thought about the strange phenomenon in the sky, 2 words appeared in his mind. Heavenly tribulation. The power of a saint-level Fu Lu was so strong that the heavens and earth believed that such a Fu Lu should not exist in this world. Therefore, when the talisman was completed, the heavenly Tao would send down a lightning tribulation. If the person who wrote the talisman could withstand it, the tribulation clouds would disperse. If the person who wrote the talisman could not withstand it, the talisman would be destroyed and the person would die. Even a heavenly tribulation had appeared. Those old foxes in the Fu Lu school must have asked him to draw a saint-level Fu Lu. In other words, he had been taken advantage of by the Fu Lu school. Limu's face was as dark as water. He had only wanted to obtain a talisman fairly, but the Fu Lu school had schemed against him. No one knew how he had survived the past 3 days. He had been extremely nervous and exhausted. 3 days of hard work had gone to someone else's disciple. This matter was not over between him and the Fu Lu school. Without 5 saint-level Fu Lu talismans, this matter would not be resolved. If they didn't give him the talismans, he would immediately call the Empress and complain. If the Fu Lu school could recruit a disciple from the Great Zhou in the future, Li Mu would take their head teacher's surname. Outside the law bell, the head teacher and the other heads acted at the same time. In the blink of an eye, the thunderclouds in the sky dissipated completely. The sky above White Cloud Mountain returned to normal. When the strange phenomenon disappeared, the disciples and trial takers heaved a sigh of relief. They wondered what was going on with that rare phenomenon. The person who had obtained first place in the trial had just succeeded in writing a talisman, and such a phenomenon had appeared above everyone's heads. Could it be that this phenomenon had something to do with him? On the main peak, the disciples looked up at the image above their heads, but they realized that it had disappeared. Below the stone steps, the trial takers looked up and realized that the figure on the stone steps had also disappeared. In the Dao Palace on the main peak, Li Mu's figure flashed out. At this moment, he was mentally exhausted and his dermic powers were depleted. He could not even stand properly. A figure supported him in time. The person supporting him was Jianghu, the fifth peak's head teacher. Li Mu's Qingxian sword was given to Lu Hanyan by him. Beside Jianghu, there were 4 other heads. Li Mu knew 2 of them, and he did not know the other 2. The Fulu school's head teacher, whom Li Mu had met before, was also there. At this moment, they were all looking at Li Mu with fervent gazes. If it were in the past, Li Mu might have been a little polite to them. After knowing that he had been made a fool of, Li Mu naturally did not have a good expression. He stretched out his hand and said, "Give me the token." He had endured until now for the sake of that talisman. When he got the token, he would settle another score with them. The head teacher of the Fulu school smiled and said, "Even without the token, you can join the ancestral court at any time and become a core disciple." The token was not for him to use. Li Mu had no desire to join the Fulu school. He did not withdraw his hand and repeated, "Give me the token." The Fulu school's head teacher calculated with his fingers and revealed a look of understanding. He said, "So it's not for yourself. Since he's your friend, you can let him come to Mount Baiyun. There's no need for trials. He can directly enter the sect and enjoy the treatment of a core disciple." Li Mu looked at the Fulu school's head teacher. The dermic powers in his body began to run amok. Why did he work so hard? Was it not for that token? Now, he was told not to use the token. Where was the Fulu school's bottom line? Where were their principles? Pfft, Li Mu spat out another mouthful of blood. He felt the world spinning. His vision turned black and he lost consciousness. Jianghu hurriedly supported him. After using his dermic powers to check, he said, "His mind is severely overdrawn. He needs to rest well." The Fulu school's head teacher held Li Mu's wrist and passed over a strand of dermic powers. He said, "Let him rest well first. We'll talk about other things after he wakes up." Although the Fulu school's talisman Dao trial was a few days later than the previous years, it had finally ended. More than 6,000 people participated in the trial. In the end, only 52 people obtained the opportunity to become a disciple of the Fulu school. Those who passed the 4 trials would stay on Mount Baiyun. The rest would return to where they came from. The younger ones among them would have the opportunity to participate in the next trial. Those who were 26 years old and above would have no chance of becoming a disciple of the Fulu school in their lifetime. When the trial ended, the strange phenomenon that occurred on Mount Baiyun became a mystery in everyone's hearts. At the entrance of the Daoist palace on the main peak, Elder Su paced back and forth with a hesitant expression. He had been pacing back and forth for a long time. "Come in." Not long after, the head teacher's voice came from within the Daoist palace. Elder Su could only stride in. He opened his mouth several times, but he stopped himself. He was conflicted about an extremely important matter. If Li Mu did not pass the trial, then he would just treat what he said last time as a joke. What about becoming a core disciple first, then an elder, then a head teacher, and finally the head teacher? Elder Su used to think that what he said was a joke. But now, he had successfully taken the first step. If he obtained first place in the trial, he would become a core disciple of the Fulu school. And the commotion above his head just now was most likely caused by him. Things seemed to be getting a little serious. He thought for a long time before raising his head to look at the Fulu school's head teacher. He said, "Head teacher, this disciple has an important matter to report." The Fulu school's head teacher listened to him and only smiled. He said, "I understand." Elder Su was somewhat stunned. He could not understand the head teacher's reaction. Ever since the establishment of the Fulu school, it had not participated in the worldly affairs of the imperial court. Although it cooperated with the imperial court, it also kept its distance. The imperial court coveted the Fulu school. This matter was not a small matter for the Fulu school. However, since the head teacher did not say anything, he could not say more. At this moment, the Fulu school's head teacher spoke again. "Send the second place of this trial here." This trial of talismans was the strangest one that Elder Su had ever seen in his life. Not to mention that rare phenomenon, no one had ever reached the 50th step in the past trials. This time, 2 people had appeared. Could it be that the heavens were foretelling that the Fulu school was about to prosper? Elder Su quickly sent the person to the Daoist palace on the main peak. The Fulu school's head teacher said, "Elder Su, you may leave." Elder Su looked at the young man with a puzzled expression, but he still left without a word. The young man stood in the Daoist palace and looked straight at the Fulu school's head teacher. The Fulu school's head teacher cupped his hands and said, "It's been 20 years since we last met, Uncle Master Fu Daozi. How have you been?" The young man's figure changed, and he turned from a young man in his 20s to an old man. The old man's hair and beard were all white, and his face was full of wrinkles. His body exuded a strong aura of lethargy. He looked at the Fulu school's head teacher and said indifferently, "Xianxia, you haven't improved in 20 years, White Cloud Peak." Li Mu woke up in bed and saw Xiao Bai and Wanwan sitting on his left and right side of the bed, worried. "Young master. Benefactor is awake." Seeing that Li Mu had woken up, smiles immediately appeared on their faces. Before Li Mu could say anything to them, he felt the spirit snail vibrate. The Empress was contacting him. Li Mu said to the 2 girls, "I'm a little hungry. Is there anything to eat at home?" Xiao Bai immediately said, "Benefactor, what do you want to eat?" "I'll make it for you," Li Mu said, "just make some porridge." Xiao Bai and Wanwan ran out to cook. Li Mu picked up the spirit snail and injected some magic power into it. In that strange space, they couldn't send messages. Before that, the 2 of them would talk for a while almost every day. Li Mu had lost contact for 3 days. During these 3 days, the Empress couldn't contact him. "In these 3 days, I've contacted you 127 times." Apart from this sentence, there was no other sound from the spirit snail. The Empress was obviously waiting for Li Mu to explain. Li Mu didn't speak. He just coughed a few times, and his voice was weak. On the other side of the spirit snail, a nervous voice with a hint of anger immediately came, "You're injured." "Who hurt you?" Li Mu said weakly, "It's just a small injury. It's not a big deal. I'm sorry to have worried your majesty." He briefly told her about the Fulu trial. The other side of the spirit snail was silent for a moment before a voice came, "If you encounter such things in the future, don't try to be brave," Li Mu said. "If you don't reach that level, you won't be able to become number 1 in the trial and get that talisman." Zhou Yi took a deep breath and said, "Remember, I don't need the Fulu school's support, and I don't want you to take risks for it." Li Mu held the spirit snail and said seriously, "For your majesty, it's nothing for me to take a little risk." Chapter 335. If he disappeared for 3 days for no reason and missed more than 100 calls from his boss, the consequences would be very serious. Unless he was not doing it for personal reasons but to get investments for his company. If he could tie Flu school to his and the Empress's war chariot, then even if the old and new parties joined forces, they could only be evenly matched with her. After chatting with the Empress for a while and coaxing her, Li Mu put away the conch. His body was still a little weak, and he did not know how long it would take for him to fully recover. Sitting on the bed, the more he thought about it, the more he felt that F. Lu's school was inhumane. The saint-level Fu Lu consumed a lot of mental energy. Even the F. Lu school's headmaster would not be able to draw it. A few 6th and 7th realms actually tricked a 4th realm rookie like him into wasting his mental energy to work for them. Was this something a human would do? Li Mu could not take this lying down no matter what. Soon, Xiao Bai finished cooking the porridge and made a few side dishes with Wan Wan. She brought them to the bedside and fed Li Mu spoonful by spoonful. At the same time, in the Daoist palace on the main peak, the F. Lu school's headmaster and several heads of the sect stared unblinkingly at a Fu Lu floating in the air. Spiritual power flowed in this Fu Lu, and it seemed to have a strange power. Even the surrounding heaven and earth became illusory. This aura, it really is saint-level. How many years has it been since a saint-level Fu Lu appeared in the ancestral court? Unbelievable, this is unbelievable. He's only at the 4th realm. If he's already like this at the 4th realm, when he grows up in the future, as long as he has enough materials, won't he be able to mass-produce saint-level or even god-level cultivators? We must keep him in F. Lu's school. He is the hope of our sect's prosperity. The few of them looked at the saint-rank talisman amulet with burning gazes. The significance of a saint-rank talisman amulet to the talisman amulet sect was too great. If the saint-level Fu Lu could be mass-produced, the structure of the 6 Daoist sects might be completely changed. Master Ashen Pine revealed a pondering expression and said, I still can't figure out how he could draw a Fu Lu. Could it be that he was once a powerhouse in the upper realm and his current body was just a body he possessed? Hyun Jinko shook his head and said, if it was a body possession, how could it hide from the supreme leader and the empress of the great Zhou? Master Ashen Pine said, but this matter is too inconceivable. It's even inexplicable. Hyun Jinko looked at him and asked, Junior brother, do you remember that there is a special constitution in this world? Master Ashen Pine thought for a moment and said in surprise, Senior brother, you mean that he possesses the rare heart of 7 orifices? In this world, most people were ordinary people, but there was no lack of talented people. For example, pure yin, pure yang, 5 elements body, and other special constitutions. If they chose the right cultivation direction, one day of cultivation would be equivalent to several days of cultivation for others. There were also natural spiritual eyes that could control fire and water. Although their cultivation speed might not be very fast, they were born with magical powers. After stepping into the path of cultivation, their strength would far surpass their peers. The heart of 7 orifices was one of the special constitutions. This kind of constitution could not increase the speed of cultivation, nor did it have magical powers. However, if they stepped into the path of cultivation, they would have an advantage that no other special constitutions had. They would not have inner demons. Not only would they not have inner demons, but any illusion, soul control, or soul-searching techniques would be useless against them. This was because their heart of 7 orifices was exquisite. They could maintain their inner calmness at any time and would not be disturbed by external matters. This was a trait that even upper realm cultivators envied. Cultivating the Tao was easy, but cultivating the heart was difficult. Inner demons did not care about the cultivation level of the cultivator, whether it was soul refining or transcending. Even transcending cultivators could not completely rid themselves of the inner demons. For cultivators with profound cultivation, the reason why they failed in writing talismans was not because they could not remember the runes, nor was it because they did not have enough magical power. It was because they could not calm their heart. They could calm their heart for a moment, but writing heaven rank or saint rank Fu Lu would take too long. It was difficult to maintain a calm heart for a long time. However, for those with the heart of 7 orifices, this worry did not exist. Others used their mind to control their heart, but he used his heart to control his mind and body. The heart of 7 orifices was the special constitution that all talisman writers desired the most. It was a pity that the quarter-hour physique was too rare. They had only heard of it in rumors. After thinking about it, they could basically confirm that Li Mu was an extremely rare person who possessed the heart of 7 orifices. Otherwise, it would be hard to explain why he could draw a saint-rank Fu Lu with only a 4th realm cultivation and the help of the sect master. This ability was a gift from the heavens, and it was something that anyone could only be envious of. He has the pure young physique and the heart of 7 orifices at the same time. Could he be the son of destiny? He is really blessed by the heavens. Not only does he have the pure young physique, but the heart of 7 orifices is even rarer, they sighed. Master Ashen Pines suddenly asked, why did Martial Uncle Fu Daozi suddenly return after leaving the sect for 20 years? Hyun Jinko shook his head and said, Martial Uncle passed the position of sect master to senior brother and not him. Martial Uncle Fu Daozi left the sect in anger. This time, he returned to the sect and used his incarnation to disturb the Talisman Dao trial. If it was not for Li Mu, this matter would not have ended. I'm afraid he came with ill intentions. Master Ashen Pine seemed to have thought of something and suddenly said, where is Martial Uncle Fu Daozi? They looked at each other and exclaimed in unison, oh no. White Cloud Peak, the small residence. As an injured person, Li Mu was enjoying the feeding service of Xiao Bai and Wan Wan when he suddenly felt a wave of exhaustion. When he realized that something was wrong and recited the heart-calming technique, Wan Wan and Xiao Bai had already collapsed. At the same time, an old man had appeared in his room. The old man's hair and beard were completely white while his face was densely covered in wrinkles. He looked extremely aged and seemed as if he would step into the coffin at any moment. When he saw Li Mu was still conscious, the old man revealed a delighted expression and said, it really is the heart of 7 orifices. This old man gave Li Mu a very familiar feeling. After checking Xiao Bai and Wan Wan and discovering that they were only unconscious, Li Mu asked sternly, who are you? The old man looked at Li Mu with burning eyes and said, I am Fu Daozi, the supreme elder of Fu Lu School. The current head of Fu Lu School, Xian Jizi, has to call me martial uncle when you see me. Little fellow, are you willing to take me as your master? Li Mu looked into the old man's eyes and finally knew why he felt this old man was so familiar. Wasn't he the young man who had almost defeated him in the Talisman Dao trial? Li Mu was stunned. He looked at him and asked, you are the supreme elder of Fu Lu School and a transcendent expert? Fu Daozi coughed and said awkwardly, I am Dongxian, but I am only 1 step away from transcendent. Only 1 step away from transcendent. The meaning of this sentence was very subtle. The Taoist priest that Li Mu knew was also 1 step away from transcendent. Vice Principal Huang of Hundred Rivers Academy was said to have 1 foot in transcendent. But his other foot might not be able to step into transcendent even if he died. If he wasn't transcendent, then he should forget about taking him as his master. Li Mu's cultivation was guided by the Empress. Even if he was transcendent, Li Mu wouldn't agree, let alone if he wasn't transcendent. He wouldn't even consider it. Li Mu shook his head and said, I don't want to. Fu Daozi was stunned and asked, why? Li Mu asked in return, what can you teach me? Fu Daozi said, I have traveled for many years and know countless divine arts. Li Mu shook his head and said, someone taught me divine arts and divine arts. Fu Daozi frowned and said, who is it? Is he stronger than me, or is he more knowledgeable than me? Li Mu said, the Empress of Great Zhou. Ahem, ahem. Fu Daozi couldn't catch his breath and coughed a few times. He couldn't compare to the Empress of Great Zhou. She had the Emperor's qi and her cultivation was transcendent. She relied on the Great Zhou court. Among the 4 sects and 6 schools, who could be more knowledgeable than the royal family? Fu Daozi thought for a moment and said, no one in Fu Lu School can compare to me in Talisman Dao cultivation. Li Mu asked, can you draw a saint-level Fu Lu? Fu Daozi, I can. Li Mu looked at him and continued, I don't need anyone to teach me the Dao of Fu Lu. Fu Daozi thought for a moment and suddenly walked forward. He grabbed Li Mu's shoulder and rushed out of the room. He flew out of Baiyun Peak and was about to fly out of the mountain. At the critical moment, Li Mu whistled. Under the support of his dermic powers, the whistle spread far and wide. Buzz. Suddenly, a buzzing sound came from the main peak. A golden light flew over and slammed into Fu Daozi. Fu Daozi's expression changed, and he hurriedly threw Li Mu aside. A golden rune appeared in each of his palms and faced the golden light. The Dao bell ignored Fu Daozi and directly enlarged. It changed direction in the air and covered Li Mu. At the same time, several auras soared into the sky from the main peak. Several figures surrounded Fu Daozi. Fu Daozi's face was gloomy as he asked, Xianjizi, are you going to go against me again today? Xianjizi looked at Fu Daozi and shook his head. His identity is special. I can't let Uncle Master take him away today. Fu Daozi said coldly, what special identity? Didn't all of you take a fancy to his heart of 7 orifices and want to keep him in Fulu school? Xianjizi said, didn't Uncle Master take a fancy to that too? Fu Daozi didn't say anything. He just looked at Xianjizi and the other peak masters with a complicated gaze. After a while, he looked at everyone and shook his head. It's been 20 years since we last met. All of you have become sect masters and peak masters, he said in a self-deprecating manner, and his body exuded a strong sense of lethargy. Hyun Jinko and the others had complicated gazes. The senior of the sect that they once respected greatly and was like the sun in the midday sky was now unavoidable. Fu Daozi looked at Xianjizi again and said, I only have less than half a year left in my lifespan. Let me take this kid away. I can't leave my legacy without a successor. Xianjizi didn't say anything. A fulu floated out of his sleeve and flew towards Fu Daozi. Looking at the talisman, Li Mu's face revealed a bitter expression. For the sake of this talisman, he had nearly worked himself to death in the past 3 days. Fu Daozi looked at the fulu and his expression changed drastically. He exclaimed, Heavenly Secret Talisman. This talisman was called the Heavenly Secret Talisman, and its function was to conceal the secrets of the heavens. This saint-grade Heavenly Secret Talisman could help him conceal the secrets of the heavens. It could at least increase his lifespan by 10 years. Xianjizi looked at Fu Daozi and said with a smile, this young friend is a subordinate of Her Majesty the Empress of the Great Zhou. If Martial Uncle wants to accept a disciple, you have to ask for his opinion. If he agrees, we won't stop you. If he doesn't agree, Martial Uncle will bring disaster to you by taking him away. After that, he looked at Li Mu and asked, young friend, are you willing to be Martial Uncle Fu Daozi's disciple? Li Mu waved his hand and said, we'll talk about this later. First, return the talisman that you owe me. Xianjizi flipped his hand and a jade talisman appeared in his palm. It slowly flew towards Li Mu. Li Mu took the jade talisman. It was unusually warm in his hand. There was a flowing golden rune in the jade talisman. Although he didn't recognize the Fulu school's talisman, he thought that the head of a sect wouldn't lie to him. After accepting the talisman, Li Mu's face darkened. He said, I'm afraid your sect has to give me and Her Majesty an explanation for using me, right? Li Mu originally wanted that saint-grade talisman amulet, but it was of great use to Talisman Daozi. In any case, Talisman Daozi was still young and had nothing but a long life, so Li Mu took it as pity on the old man. However, Li Mu didn't intend to let Xianjizi and the others off so easily. Xianjizi knew what Li Mu was talking about. He asked, what explanation do you want, Lord Li? Since Li Mu called himself this official, Xianjizi called him Lord Li. At this moment, the conversation between the two was between the Fulu school and the Great Zhou court. Li Mu was waiting for him to say this. He said, 5 saint-level Fulu. Xianjizi nodded and said, okay. Li Mu was stunned for a moment. When he came back to his senses, he regretted it. He felt that he had suffered a loss. He asked for 5 saint-level Fulu, but Xianjizi actually agreed without hesitation. If he had known, he would have asked for 10, he still hadn't seen the world. His vision was too small, however, since he had said it, Li Mu couldn't go back on his words. Otherwise, not only would he lose face, but also the Empress's. He could be shameless, but the Empress's dignity had to be protected at all times. Fu Daozi held the saint-level Fulu with a complicated look in his eyes. Xianxia looked at him and said, "Welcome back, martial uncle." Hyun Jinko and the others also cupped their fists and bowed. They said, "Welcome back, martial uncle." Limu didn't want to get involved in the affairs of the Fulu school. He took the Dao bell and flew to Baiyun Peak. He saw Wanwan and Xiaobai looking anxious. Beside them was a figure that Limu had missed for a long time. Young master. Benefactor. Limu flew to the courtyard and patted the heads of the two little girls. He said, "Don't worry, I'm fine." Then, he pulled Lu Hanyan into his arms and said, "If you didn't come out of seclusion, I would have to return to the divine capital." Lu Hanyan said with a red face, "I counted the days and thought that you should be here. Master said that I was restless these 2 days and that seclusion was useless, so he let me out." After she said that, she thought of something and held Limu's hand. She asked, "I heard from Wanwan and Xiaobai that you participated in the Talisman Dao trial. Didn't you say that you didn't want to become a disciple of the Fulu school?" Limu was stunned for a moment. Then, he hugged her tightly again and said, "Because I want to be in the same sect as you." Chapter 336. Participating in the Talisman Dao trial was killing 3 birds with 1 stone. They could get the talisman and give Li Qing a chance to return to the Fulu school in the future. They could also become fellow disciples with Lu Hanyan and have a closer relationship. They could also take the opportunity to infiltrate the Fulu school and become the Empress's spy in the Fulu school. The 3 of them could answer to anyone. It was the best of 3, killing 3 birds with 1 stone. Lu Hanyan was touched and snuggled in Limu's arms. The 2 of them were affectionate for a while. While Lu Hanyan was bathing, Limu went to the main peak of Baiyun Mountain. He still had not settled the score with the Fulu school's head teacher. He had no choice but to join the Fulu school. Otherwise, he would be exposed in front of the Empress and Lu Hanyan. Of these 2 women, one could make him unable to attend court, and the other could make him unable to sleep. He could not afford to offend either of them. However, he still had great use for the talisman in the future, so he could not use it on himself. Fortunately, the Fulu school's head teacher said that he could join the sect without the talisman. It should not be a polite remark. However, before joining the sect, Limu had to settle the score first. When he became a disciple of the Fulu school, he would be family with them. This score was not easy to settle. Baiyun Mountain, Daoist Palace on the main peak. The Fulu school's head teacher, Xianxia, looked at Limu and asked, "Young friend, your mind is injured. Why don't you recuperate on Baiyun Mountain?" Limu cursed in his heart. How shameless. How could they not know why his mind was injured? If they did not use him, how could his mind be injured? Limu looked at him and said calmly, "I'm here to get my 5 heaven-grade Fulu." Xianxia said, "There are only a few heaven-grade Fulu in the ancestral court every year, and they are all given to core disciples. I don't have any now." Limu's face darkened as he asked, "You lied to me?" Xianxia smiled and said, "When your mind recovers, I can ask the peak masters to help you draw 5 of them. The materials used for the talismans will be provided by the ancestral court." Limu looked at Xianxia in a daze. He couldn't imagine that someone like him who looked like an immortal could actually smile and say such shameless words. It was one thing to use him, but to compensate him for his Fulu, he had to draw it himself. Was this something a sect leader would do? Limu took a deep breath and swallowed his anger. After all, his wife was still in Fulu school, and he would need their help in the future. As long as he had the materials, it was fine for him to draw it himself. Sooner or later, he would get his revenge somewhere else. Today, he blackmailed him for 5 Fulu, and tomorrow, Limu would kidnap his family's Zhong. At this time, Xianxia said, "According to the past practice, the disciples recruited by the Talisman Dao trial can only become the 4th-generation disciples. If you enter the Fulu school, I can make an exception and let you become a disciple of a peak master." As soon as he finished speaking, a figure walked into the Dao Palace. Li Mu looked back and found that the person was Fu Daozi, who was called Uncle Master by Xianxia and the others. Talisman Daozi walked up to Li Mu and passed a jade slip to him. He said, "Even though you're unwilling to take me as your master, you've given me 10 more years of lifespan. I'll give you my lifetime's comprehension of the Talisman Dao. I hope you'll be able to bring my Talisman Dao to greater heights." Xianxia looked at the old man and said, "There are many talented disciples in the ancestral court. If Uncle Master is willing, you can choose one of them to inherit your mantle." Daoist Talisman revealed a proud expression as he said, "They aren't worthy of inheriting my mantle." Xianxia shook his head but didn't say anything. Although this Uncle Master's attainments in the Talisman Dao were extraordinary, he had a strange temper. Otherwise, he wouldn't have left the Fulu school 20 years ago. He could only give him advice on this matter and couldn't make the decision for him. Li Mu stood in the Dao Palace and thought quickly. He definitely had to join the Fulu school. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to explain it to the Empress and Lu Hanyan. Xianxia just said that he could choose a peak master. In this way, he would become a third-generation disciple like Lu Hanyan. The sect master and the peak masters were all second-generation disciples. Li Mu had been unhappy with them for a long time and didn't want to be inferior to them after joining the sect. If he became Fu Daozi's disciple, he would be a second-generation disciple and be in the same generation as the sect master and the peak masters. He would also be able to take charge of the Fulu school in the second half of the plan. Now that he had the status, the only thing he lacked was his cultivation. When his cultivation improved, he could draw Fulu at will and bring glory to the Fulu school. At that time, how could Xianxia still have the face to occupy the position of the sect master? Thinking of this, Li Mu suddenly looked at Fu Daozi and said, "I'm willing to be your disciple." Xianxia was stunned. Fu Daozi was stunned for a moment before he looked at Li Mu in surprise and asked, "What did you say?" Li Mu cupped his fists and bowed to him. He repeated, "I'm willing to be your disciple." Fu Daozi grabbed his hand and said excitedly, "Good, good, good. I didn't expect that I would be able to take in a disciple with the heart of 7 orifices before I die. Don't worry, before I die, I will teach you all my Talisman Dao comprehension." Li Mu didn't know what the heart of 7 orifices was, but since Fu Daozi had the first impression and explained it for him, he didn't even have to make up a reason. Originally, he was slightly resistant to taking a stranger as his master. But at this moment, when he saw an old man with one foot in the grave, who was so excited that his eyes were filled with tears and his white beard was trembling, for some reason, that trace of resistance quickly disappeared. Li Mu said with a smile, "When my mind recovers, I will draw a few more heavenly secret talismans for you." Fu Daozi said with a gratified expression, "The heavenly secret talisman can only conceal the heavenly secret once. After 10 years, if I can't advance to the transcendence realm, it will be the day of my death. However, I have no regrets to take in such a disciple. So what if those old fellows have a higher cultivation than me? Can their disciples be as powerful as my disciples?" A moment later, in a Dao palace behind the main peak, Li Mu knelt on the ground and bowed respectfully to Fu Daozi 3 times. He said, "Greetings, Master." The Grand Elder's disciple recruitment was supposed to be a grand ceremony. 3 months in advance, all the disciples of the Talisman Puppet sect's ancestral court and the sect masters of the subsects were supposed to come from all over to congratulate him. As soon as Xianxia proposed it, Li Mu and Fu Daozi rejected it at the same time. Li Mu didn't want to be high profile, but Fu Daozi obviously had other reasons. Fu Daozi personally helped Li Mu up and said, 20 years ago, I was dissatisfied with senior brother passing the position of sect master to Xianxia, so I left Mount Baiyun in anger. This time, I returned to the mountain only to find a disciple to pass on my Talisman Dao before the end of my life. As for other miscellaneous matters, it's better to avoid them." Li Mu could feel the lethargy in his body and the unwillingness in his tone. He could only say, "There are still 10 years. Perhaps in these 10 years, Master can find a way to transcend." Fu Daozi shook his head and said, "If I could find it, I would have found it long ago. You don't have to feel sorry for me. I have experienced everything in my life. If I can find a disciple who can pass on my talisman Dao before the end of my life, I will die without regrets. At that time, you can find a mountain on Mount Baiyun and bury me. Every year, you can come to burn an incense stick, so that we won't be in vain." He was disappointed for a while, but then he became excited again. He looked at Li Mu with shining eyes and said, "There are still 10 years. You can do a lot of things in 10 years. You have the heart of 7 orifices, so you can definitely pass on my talisman Dao. Unfortunately, it's difficult for you to break through to the transcendence realm in 10 years. Otherwise, I can see with my own eyes that you become the sect master of Fu Lu School." Li Mu was stunned for a moment and said uncertainly, "Sect? Sect master?" Fu Daozi sneered and said, "When you break through to the transcendence realm, as long as you have the materials, you can have as many saint-level Fu Lu as you want. At that time, Fu Lu School will rely on you to develop. Xian Jizi won't have the face to hold on to the position of sect master. He stole my position, so I will let my disciples steal his position." After Li Mu came back to his senses, he looked at Fu Daozi and said firmly, "Don't worry, master. I will work hard to improve my cultivation and avenge you." "Good disciple." Fu Daozi laughed and said, "Let's go. Let's get to know your senior brothers and sisters again. It's a pity that those 2 old guys are not here. They have more good things." Li Mu soon understood what "get to know them again" meant. He touched the flask heaven ring on his finger and thought, "Sooner or later, I will have to change to a bigger space ring." On Jade Emperor Peak, Master Xingyang took out a Fulu with extreme heartache and passed it to Li Mu. He said, "This is senior brother's gift for our first meeting. Junior brother, you must accept it." On Azure Profound Peak, Qian Jinko had an embarrassed expression as he looked at Fu Daozi and said, "Martial uncle, I don't have anything good in my possession right now. Can I?" Fu Daozi frowned and said, "Where's your Azure Profound sword?" Qian Jinko sighed and said, "I gave it to junior brother Li's Dao companion last time." On Sungling Peak, Master Ashen Pine passed a stack of Fulu to Li Mu and said, "Senior brother doesn't have any heaven rank Fulu, but these are high-grade earth rank Fulu. Junior brother, please accept them." On White Cloud Peak, Fu Daozi listened to the report of an elder and said, "What? Yuzhen is in closed-door cultivation? Where is she? I'll go wake her up." Li Mu hurriedly stopped him, "Master, forget it, forget it. It's not too late to wait for her to come out." 2 hours later, Li Mu landed on White Cloud Peak again. He touched the ring on his hand once again. Other than Yuzhen, who had yet to come out of closed-door cultivation, all the first seats, including the sect master, had been severely blackmailed. If it wasn't for Li Mu stopping him, Fu Daozi might have forcefully called Yuzhen out of closed-door cultivation. Lu Hanyan had already finished bathing. She walked to Li Mu's side and asked, "Have you joined a sect?" Li Mu nodded. Lu Hanyan looked up at him and asked rather proudly, "Then are you going to call me martial uncle in the future?" Li Mu shook his head. He was now a second-generation disciple of the Fulu school and was of the same generation as the Fulu school's sect master, her master Yuzhen, and the first seats of the peak. Lu Hanyan was slightly stunned and then said, "Could it be that you've also become the disciple of a first seat of a peak?" Li Mu continued to shake his head. Lu Hanyan thought for a moment and muttered, "Could it be that your master is the sect master? Even if that's the case, you still have to call me senior sister." Li Mu knocked her head lightly and looked at her with a smile. "Martial niece Lu, don't be rude to your martial uncle." Chapter 337. Martial niece, I'll give in to you." Yu Hanyan pinched Li Mu's waist and said through gritted teeth, "You're not allowed to get on my bed tonight." Being a second-generation disciple of the Fugu school, the same generation as the head of the sect, was something to be proud of. But Li Mu obviously showed off to the wrong person. It was late at night. He lay alone on the bed in the wing room, staring at the roof in a daze. There were always many unpredictable things in life. Before coming to Mount Baiyun, Li Mu didn't expect that he would participate in the trial of Talisman Taoism, become the disciple of the Grand Elder, and shoulder the heavy responsibility of becoming the next head of the sect. Whether it was for the Empress or for Talisman Daoist's last wish, he inexplicably had another great goal. Late at night, Li Mu took out the jade slip given to him by Talisman Daoist and put it on his forehead. In this jade slip, there were more than 100 years of Talisman Daoist's comprehension of Talisman Taoism. Compared with these powerhouses who had been immersed in Talisman Taoism for decades or even hundreds of years, Li Mu didn't even know a little about Talisman Taoism. He only knew how to draw talismans, but he didn't know anything about talismans. This jade slip undoubtedly opened the door to a new world for Li Mu. It let Li Mu know that Talisman Taoism could be used in this way. Talisman Daoist was a once-in-a-century genius of Talisman Taoism, but his talent in cultivation was not particularly outstanding. So far, he had not taken the key step. Even though with his attainments in Talisman Taoism, he could fight against a Transcendent Realm Master with his cultivation in Dongxian, but he was still not a Transcendent Realm Master. Under the Transcendent Realm, the lifespan of cultivators was not much longer than that of humans. Because of cultivation and health preservation, cultivators in Dongxian could live for more than 60 years, which was equivalent to the oldest among mortals. If there were no accidents, cultivators in the Divine Power Realm and the Creation Realm could live for more than 100 years. The reason why cultivators seemed to live longer was that they were free from disease and disaster, and they knew how to cultivate and maintain their health. Therefore, they could easily live for decades or even hundreds of years. Mortals lived for decades. If they paid attention to their health, their lifespan might not be shorter than cultivators. Talisman Daoist had already lived for 2 cycles of 60 years, and his life was about to end. Even though the heavenly secret talisman could buy him 10 years of time, he would still perish if he couldn't advance within these 10 years. The jade slip contained all his comprehensions of the Tao of talismans. Li Mu could sense the expectations that Talisman Daoist had for him. He truly regarded Li Mu as his personal disciple. Li Mu and the Empress were actually the same type of people. Because of loneliness, if anyone treated them well, they would return the favor tenfold. Li Mu wanted to help Fu Daoist, but unfortunately, he was powerless to do so. He let out a long sigh. Suddenly, the door was opened from the outside. Yu Hanyan walked to the bedside and said angrily, "Why don't you come over?" Li Mu put away his thoughts and said sadly, "Weren't you the one who didn't let me go over?" Yu Hanyan glared at him and said, "You don't go over just because I don't let you. When did you listen to me?" Li Mu knew that her self-control was worse than his. She would definitely lose it before him. At this time, he couldn't be stubborn anymore. He pulled her into his arms and said, Okay, it was my fault during the day. In the future, we'll talk about our own matters. Anyway, we won't stay on Mount Baiyun for long. By the way, your cultivation is already at the Divine Power Realm. Do you want to go back to the Divine Capital with me? Yu Hanyan sighed and said, I want to, but my cultivation is now at a critical moment. If I go into seclusion with Master for a few more months, I'll be able to break through to the 5th realm. Li Mu was shocked and asked, so soon? Yu Hanyan said proudly, I'm now cultivating the Pure Yin technique. Every step of my cultivation is guided by Master. Mount Baiyun is full of spiritual energy and there are endless spiritual jades. If I go into seclusion for a few more months, then, Li Mu asked, then what? Yu Hanyan lowered her head and said softly, then, as long as we really do dual cultivation, I'll be able to borrow your pure yang energy. When yin and yang converge, I'll break through the bottleneck. Li Mu and Yu Hanyan hugged and kissed. They had done most of the things that couples should do. However, there was still one most important thing that they hadn't done. Firstly, the concept of this era was different. That step had to be taken on the night of the wedding. Only then would there be a sense of ceremony. Secondly, when the yin and yang converged, it was the best time to break through. If they lost it now, their cultivation would increase a little. However, they would still encounter a bottleneck when the time came. The bottleneck between each realm was the hardest to break through. Being stuck at a bottleneck for decades was nothing new in the cultivation world. There were only a few months left. When he returned to Chengdu, Li Mu had to start preparing for the wedding. The attraction between pure yin and pure yang was irresistible. The two of them reunited after a short separation. They only came out of the room after lunch the next day. Li Mu's original plan was to accompany her for 3 months. However, her cultivation was at a critical moment. 3 days later, she went into seclusion again. 3 days later, Li Mu came to the main peak of Mount Baiyun again. He still had something important to do. When Yu Hanyan entered the sect, Hyun Jinko gave her a chance to comprehend the Tao page. Although what she comprehended was a copy, she gained a lot. As a second-generation disciple, Li Mu could directly comprehend the original page of the Tao page. In the Tao Palace, Xian Jizi stretched out his hand. A yellowed piece of paper appeared in his palm. There were no words on the paper. It looked simple and unadorned as it floated quietly in Hyun Jinko's palm. Fu Daozi stood beside Li Mu and said seriously, "The Tao page is a page of the Tao scripture. It contains the supreme Tao." The founder of the Fugu school obtained this page. After comprehending it, he left the Fugu school's orthodoxy behind. This is a rare opportunity. Study it well. It will be of great benefit to your future cultivation. Xian Jizi looked at Li Mu and said, "This page of the Tao scripture contains the talisman's Tao. Different people will comprehend different things. How much you can comprehend will depend on your luck." Li Mu had a good understanding of the Tao scripture. It was said that most of the supernatural powers, Tao techniques, talisman, pills, and array formations in the current cultivation world originated from the Tao scripture. Anyone who obtained any page of the Tao scripture could establish a sect. That was how the 6 sects of the Tao sect came about. The Tao page slowly floated over from Xian Jizi's palm. Li Mu reached out and pressed his hand on it. In the next moment, he entered a white world. Unlike the world he entered when he participated in the trial, this world was a vast expanse of white. Even when Li Mu put his hand in front of his eyes, he could only see white. He was wrapped in a white fog that he could not see clearly. In the fog, there was a flash of golden light from time to time. It was so fast that one could not see it clearly. Li Mu tried to chase after the golden light, but the golden light flashed and disappeared. The more he wanted to see it clearly, the faster the golden light flashed in the white fog. In the end, he could only see a blurry afterimage. This feeling was similar to when Li Mu first drew talismans. The more he wanted to draw it in one go, the more restless his heart was and the greater the possibility of failure. Therefore, Li Mu sat down cross-legged and began to recite the Clear Heart Sutra. In the Tao Palace of the main peak, Xian Jizi looked at Li Mu, who was sitting cross-legged, and said indifferently, "It seems that he has found the trick. I wonder how many talisman he can comprehend in the end." Talisman Daozi asked, "How many did you comprehend back then?" Xian Jizi said, "I'm ashamed. I only comprehended 10. I can't compare to Martial Uncle." Talisman Daozi glanced at him and said, "But your luck isn't bad. The talismans you've comprehended are new talismans that no one else has comprehended. Amongst the 15 talismans I've comprehended, 8 of them were comprehended by others." Xian Jizi looked at Li Mu and said, "I just don't know how lucky Junior Brother is." In the white fog space, as Li Mu's heart calmed down, he noticed that the white fog in front of him seemed to have faded a little. At the same time, the golden light flashing in the fog slowed down. He could vaguely see that it was a talisman made of runes. However, the talisman was still very fast and he could not see the details clearly. Li Mu was not in a hurry and continued to recite the Clear Heart Sutra. The white fog in front of him became thinner and the speed of the talisman became slower. Gradually, Li Mu could see the details of the talisman. This was a talisman that Li Mu had never seen before. Judging from the complexity of the runes, it should be above the mid-grade of the heaven rank. Li Mu remembered the talisman in his heart and looked further ahead. As the fog gradually faded, Li Mu could gradually see the talisman flashing in the distance. Obviously, as long as his heart was calm, he would be able to see further, more clearly, and more talismans. Li Mu was no longer anxious. He closed his eyes and began to recite the Clear Heart Sutra again and again. After reciting it countless times, Li Mu slowly opened his eyes. The scene in front of him stunned him. The surrounding white fog was gone. He sat cross-legged on the ground and there was an extremely vast land in front of him. On the land, there were many monsters that Li Mu had never seen before. These monsters were hundreds of feet tall and emitted an extremely terrifying aura. They wreaked havoc on the land. Wherever they went, mountains collapsed and rivers flowed in reverse. These ugly but incomparably powerful monsters were slowly walking towards Li Mu. Behind Li Mu, there were countless figures floating in the air. These people stretched out their hands and drew lines in the air. Wherever their fingertips passed, golden light condensed and formed runes. Finally, they converged into a talisman and flew towards these monsters. The golden light that Li Mu had seen just now was the scene of these talisman flying in front of his eyes. It was just that at that time, his eyes were filled with white fog and he could not see where these talisman came from or went. These talisman flew over the heads of these monsters. Some summoned incomparably thick lightning dragons and smashed the monsters into ashes. Some turned into balls of flames and engulfed the monsters. Some froze the monsters and then collapsed. In this place, Li Mu had seen many talisman that he had never seen or heard of before. Many doubts appeared in his mind. What were these huge monsters with terrifying auras? He had read a lot of books and was familiar with the records of monsters in the 10 continents, but he had never seen any description of them. If these things really existed, even if they were not in the ancestral state, there would definitely be records of them. And who were those people behind him wearing strange clothes? Their fighting style was so strange that they could actually draw talismans out of thin air without using talisman materials. Although today's transcendent experts could also draw talismans out of thin air, the power of the talisman was far from being comparable to the ones in this scene. Li Mu had many mysteries in his heart that had not been solved. Just as he was about to look for a while, the previous scene suddenly changed. He returned to the Dao Palace on the main peak again. In front of him were Xian Jizi and Fu Daozi. Fu Daozi looked at Li Mu and asked expectantly, "How many talisman did you see?" "How many?" Li Mu recalled for a moment and recalled the talismans that filled the sky and densely covered the entire sky. He said, "There should be around 1,000. Chapter 338. Qian or 800? Fu Daozi looked at Li Mu in a daze. Even Xian Jizi's expression was full of shock. The Tao page was extremely mysterious. Since ancient times, those who could comprehend several Tao pages from it were already geniuses. Those who could comprehend more than 10 Tao pages were geniuses among geniuses. Those disciples later became famous masters of the Fugu school. They couldn't find a single word to describe it. Li Mu couldn't figure out their expressions and asked, "What's wrong? Is there a problem?" After Fu Daozi came to his senses, he asked again, "How many talisman do you remember?" Li Mu said embarrassedly, 1. In fact, he had only carefully memorized the first talisman. Later, Li Mu was stunned by the scene after the white fog dissipated. The huge monster and the strange human were beyond his knowledge and experience. How could he be in the mood to memorize the talisman? That's impossible. Fu Daozi's face was full of disbelief. Then he asked Li Mu, "What did you see in the Tao page?" Li Mu said, "A continent where powerful monsters wreaked havoc. Some human beings could condense talismans in the void and draw powerful talismans. They used the talisman to attack and seal those monsters." Fu Daozi was stunned. He looked at Xian Jizi and asked, "What did you see at the beginning?" Xian Jizi said slowly, "White fog." Occasionally, a golden talisman flashed through the white fog. Fu Daozi looked at Li Mu again and said in confusion, "It's strange. All the people who comprehended the Tao page saw fog." "Why did you see this?" Li Mu explained, "In the beginning, there was only white fog. However, as one's heart calmed down, the white fog would become thinner. When one's heart calmed down completely, the white fog would completely dissipate. The golden talismans that you saw flashing through the white fog were created by those humans. They used their fingers to draw talismans in the air. Their purpose was to attack some of the monsters in the fog. I knew it, I knew it. After Fu Daozi finished listening to Li Mu's description, an excited expression appeared on his face, and he said, during the ancient times, the spirit energy of the heavens and the earth was extremely dense, so writing talismans didn't require the assistance of spirit liquids. Later on, the spirit energy of the heavens and the earth thinned greatly, so the seniors of the Dao sect relied on various spirit objects of the heavens and the earth to liquefy their spirit energy and use it as materials for writing talismans. This old man's guess is true, it's true. Li Mu said regretfully, it's a pity that I didn't pay much attention to the talisman just now. If I can comprehend the Dao page again, should be able to remember it. Xianxia shook his head, you can only comprehend the Dao page once. Everyone only has one chance. Even if you touch it again, you won't be able to enter the world just now. However, what you see on the Dao page will be deeply engraved in your memory. As long as you meditate, you'll be able to recall it again. Hearing Xianxia's words, Li Mu closed his eyes and thought back to the scene he had just seen. Sure enough, the things he had seen on the Dao page appeared once again, and very clearly. Fu Daozi asked expectantly, do you remember now? Li Mu nodded, yes. Fu Daozi continued to ask, what kind of talisman are there? Li Mu closed his eyes and stretched out his finger. According to the scene in his mind, he drew a few talismans in the void and said, this talisman can turn an area into a sea of fire. The fire is blue and doesn't seem to be ordinary fire. As long as you touch it, you won't be able to get rid of it. Then he changed to another talisman and continued to speak. This talisman can summon a lightning dragon, this talisman can freeze an area of 10,000 feet, this talisman can turn the earth into magma, this talisman can summon huge meteorites. After copying dozens of talisman, Li Mu opened his eyes and said, there are too many talisman. I'm afraid there are more than 1,000 talismans. I can't finish them all in a short time. Fu Daozi looked at Li Mu in shock. After a while, he finally came to his senses and looked at Tianjizi, saying, you should abdicate. He put one hand on Tianjizi's shoulder and said, the Fuga school is destined to prosper in the hands of my disciple. If you don't give up the position of the headmaster, you will be hindering the prosperity of our sect. You have to apologize to the ancestors, Li Mu hurriedly said, Master, forget it. There's no hurry. Fu Daozi didn't insist to the end. Instead, he said happily, after seeing those talisman, I have comprehended something. I need to cultivate in seclusion for a few days to comprehend it. Fu Daozi left in a hurry. Li Mu stood in the Taoist palace and asked Xianxia, what are those monsters? Xianxia shook his head and said, in ancient times, the spiritual qi of heaven and earth was rich and everything flourished. However, there weren't many things that were really passed down from that era. Everything that happened in that era has always been a mystery in the cultivation world. Li Mu asked doubtfully, the Dao scripture didn't seem to be born that long ago, did it? Xianxia explained, people think that the Dao scripture was compiled by countless Taoist seniors more than 1,000 years ago. But in fact, the Dao scripture has existed for even longer. Perhaps it can be traced back to the ancient times. At that time, the Taoist seniors only passed down the orthodoxy of the various Taoist sects by comprehending the Dao pages. The ancient times were a long time ago for the people of this world. There were few records about the ancient times in this era. For some reason, the inheritance between the two eras was broken. The only thing that could be confirmed was that the spiritual qi of heaven and earth was very rich in the ancient times, which was many times richer than today's. The cultivation of cultivators was related to spiritual qi. The masters of this era all stopped at the transcendence realm. In that era, there should have been cultivators at the 8th or even the 9th realm. Li Mu thought of those monsters. Their strength might be related to the density of spiritual qi. With the thin spiritual qi of heaven and earth, it was difficult for such huge monsters to be born. They might have gone extinct in the long river of time. No one could explain the scene that happened in the Dao page to Li Mu. Li Mu stopped thinking about it and asked Xianxia, is there any way to show the scenes that I saw in the Tao page? Xianxia shook his head and said, you can show ordinary memories with the cultivation strength of the fifth realm. However, you can't show the insights in the Tao page. Li Mu found that he couldn't show the scenes in his mind with spiritual spell visual projection. It seemed that the problem didn't lie with him but with the Tao page. He waved his hand and said, I'll go back now. Don't forget that you still owe me 5 heaven-level talisman. Standing in the Daoist palace, Xianxia watched him leave as if he saw the beginning of the change in the cultivation world. White Cloud Peak. Li Mu had been in seclusion cultivation for 7 days after he returned. After 7 days, he opened the door and stood in the courtyard. Under the long-awaited sunlight, he stretched lazily. During these 7 days, he had watched the scenes that he saw in the Tao page countless times. He recorded all the talisman that he could see and organized them into a jade slip. Similar to a USB flash drive, jade slips were used by cultivators to store information. If it was recorded on paper, it would take at least 1,300 pages. If it was recorded on jade slips, 1 jade slip would be enough. Li Mu flew up and came to the main peak again. Then, he landed in a Daoist palace. Talisman Daozi walked out. Li Mu handed him the jade slip and said, Master, take this. Talisman Daozi took the jade slip and asked, what's this? Li Mu said with a smile, you'll know when you see it. Talisman Daozi pressed the jade slip to his forehead. His expression gradually became sluggish, and even his body trembled slightly. Li Mu looked at him and said, these are all the talisman images in the Tao page. I hope you can understand the great Tao of the talisman from them, Master. Talisman Daozi looked at Li Mu with his beard trembling. He tried to speak several times but failed. Li Mu bowed and said, I won't disturb Master. I'll go back now. He flew out of the Daoist palace and returned to the White Cloud Peak. He let out a long sigh of relief. This was the only thing he could do for Talisman Daozi. Li Mu used the talismans on the Tao page to repay the favor of Talisman Daozi for giving him the comprehension of the Tao of talismans. As for whether Talisman Daozi could comprehend the Tao of transcendence from it, that would depend on himself. Not long after, an aura familiar to Li Mu landed outside the small building. Li Mu opened the door. Elder Su said respectfully, Uncle Master Li, the sect master invites you in. In less than half a month, he had changed the way he addressed Li Mu from Lord Li to Uncle Master Li. Although Xianxia listened to Talisman Daozi and didn't publicize this matter in the sect, he still informed the third-generation elders in the sect. Li Mu came to the main peak's Tao Palace and found that other than Xianxia, the other heads were also there. Li Mu cupped his hands and said, Greetings, sect master, senior brothers and senior sisters. With a master who was a supreme elder, it was much more convenient for him to move around Baiyun Mountain. Even if he met the sect master and the sect master, he only had to greet them as equals. Xianxia looked at Li Mu and said, the materials for the talisman are ready. Junior brother, you can start at any time. After this period of rest, Li Mu's injuries had healed and his mind had returned to its peak state. Drawing a saint-level talisman might be a little difficult, but for a heaven-level talisman, it shouldn't be a problem for him to draw 5 of them in one go. Drawing talismans wasn't difficult for him. The difficult thing was to gather the materials. The cultivators in the ancient times could draw talismans in the void because the spiritual qi of heaven and earth was rich at that time. When the spiritual qi was thin, they had to find natural treasures that contained spiritual qi to replace it. Li Mu borrowed Xianxia's magic power and drew 5 heaven-level talisman in one go. He let out a sigh of relief. At this time, Xianxia said, there is still some talisman liquid left. Junior brother, do you want to draw a few more? Li Mu wiped the sweat from his forehead and said in a bad mood, draw? Do you think I'm a tool for drawing talismans? Xianxia sighed and said, the great competition of the peaks is about to begin. In every competition, the top 3 disciples will be rewarded with a heaven-level talisman. In the ancestral court, except for junior brother, no one has 100% confidence. This talisman liquid is extremely precious. As a member of the Fugu school, junior brother can't bear to waste it, right? Li Mu looked at the serious face of Xianxia and understood that he still had a lot to learn if he wanted to be the sect master of the Fugu school. Chapter 339. Li Mu had originally thought that he had profited greatly by becoming Fu Daozi's disciple and becoming a second-generation disciple of the Fu Lu school for the Empress. Now, he realized that these old foxes seemed to be even more scheming. Although there were many people in the Fu Lu school who could draw a heaven-grade Fu Lu, they didn't have a 100% success rate and might cause a waste of precious talisman fluid. In order not to waste materials, they seemed to be planning to use Li Mu as a tool. He had always been the one to use others as tools, so this was how it felt to be used as a tool. However, Li Mu couldn't refuse. Xianxi's reason was very sufficient. Li Mu was a disciple of the talisman sect, so he naturally had the responsibility to save resources for the sect. If Li Mu refused, it would be disloyal to the sect. How could someone who was disloyal to the Fu Lu school become the Fu Lu school's headmaster? Thus, Li Mu was able to draw 3 more heaven-grade Fu Lu. The function of these Fu Lu was to repair the physical body. Even if one's limbs were chopped off, they could be regenerated in an extremely short amount of time. In the underground karst cave, Wu Bo had been ambushed by senior brother Qin and crushed his heart. He had used this talisman to regenerate a new heart. Anyone wouldn't be able to endure 8 times in 2 hours. After Li Mu finished the last stroke, he supported himself on a stone pillar in the Dao Palace and walked to the front of the hall. Then, he collapsed comfortably on a chair. He would rather return to the divine capital and be squeezed dry by the Empress than be squeezed dry by a group of old men here. Li Mu only lacked magic power to draw heaven-grade or even saint-grade Fu Lu. If he had the Empress' magic power and enough materials, he could draw as many as he wanted. He had always been taking from the Empress and had never given anything in return. When he returned to the Immortals' capital, he would also draw some Fu Lu for the Empress. Although the Empress was rich, she didn't have a lot of good things on her. For example, the heaven rank Fu Lu was a rare item in the Fu Lu school. In the 10 continents and 3 islands, besides the Fu Lu school, almost no one could draw a Fu Lu of this level. The only one the Empress gave to Li Mu was one that Li Mu gave to Xiao Bai for protection. Other than that, the highest rank Fu Lu she gave to Li Mu was only Earth rank. This was obviously not in line with the status of the Empress of the Great Zhou. She always carried a stack of heavenly rank Fu Lu with her. In the future, when she rewarded her meritorious subjects, she would be able to take it out. The position where Li Mu was lying was the headmaster's position. Fu Lu's school had a hierarchy, and his action was against the rules. However, the heads only looked at each other and didn't say anything. They had already heard from the headmaster that he had comprehended all of the pages. The founder of the Fu Lu school only comprehended a portion of the pages, and yet he was able to establish the Fu Lu school. What would happen if he comprehended all of it? At that time, the title of the number 1 Daoist sect would change hands. Xianxia looked at Li Mu, who was lying on the chair, and asked, "Junior brother, have you comprehended all of the pages?" Li Mu extended his hand, and a jade slip appeared in his palm. He threw the jade slip to Xianxia and said, "The Fu Lu that appeared in the pages are all in here." Nothing ventured, nothing gained. The future leader had to have the bearing of a future leader. Li Mu was not worried that he would starve to death if he taught others the way of talismans. The stronger the talisman sect was, the more beneficial it would be for him and the Empress. Xianxia placed the jade slip on his forehead, and a moment later, he passed it to Hyunjinko, who was beside him. After Hyunjinko read it, he passed it to Zhengyang Zi. Apart from Yuzhen Zi, who was in seclusion, the other 6 heads all looked at the jade slip with longing and excitement in their eyes. They all knew what this jade slip meant. The founder of the Fu Lu school founded, and Li Mu would lead the Fu Lu school to an unprecedented peak. Not to mention that he had completely comprehended the pages and contributed the complete contents of the pages, just by relying on his heart of 7 orifices. If he was tied to the Fu Lu school and drew talismans day and night, in the future, the Fulu school's disciples would each have a saint level attacking Fulu. Their attacks would be at the 7th realm, and they would be able to beat the 10 demonic sects together. Unfortunately, they couldn't tie him up. Not to mention that the materials needed for a saint-level Fulu were hard to find, and it was impossible to create an unlimited number of them. Martial Uncle Fu Daozi would also not allow them to do so. Not to mention, he had the Empress of the Great Zhou behind him. He was a treasure in the Fulu school, and in the heart of the Empress, he would also be a treasure. If the Fulu school forcibly detained him, it was very likely that the Great Zhou court would send a large force to suppress them. The strength of the Fulu school was unquestionable, but in the Great Zhou, the strength of any sect could not compare to the Great Zhou court. Xian Jizi put away the jade slip and bowed to Li Mu with cupped fists, saying, "Thank you, junior brother." As the head of the Fulu school, his bow represented the highest etiquette of the Fulu school. He bowed to Li Mu for his contributions to the Fulu school, and for bringing the Fulu school to a new height. Li Mu waved his hand and said, "We're on the same side, there's no need to thank me." Xian Jizi smiled and said, "In that case, senior brother won't be polite." Chapter 342. There were many branches of Taoism: Fulu, pills, formations, martial Tao, divine arts. Under each major branch, there were countless smaller branches. The cultivation world revered divine arts and Daoist techniques. Xuanzong, which was famous for its Daoist techniques and divine arts, was also the strongest among the 6 sects of Taoism. Comparatively speaking, Fulu school was a minority in the cultivation world. However, no one dared to look down on a minority like Fulu school. It was to the extent that most of the cultivators would rather compete with the disciples of the Xian sect in terms of divine path and arts or engage in close combat with the disciples of the South sect than to fight with the disciples of the Talisman sect. This was because they didn't know the trump cards of Fulu school disciples. Once they looked down on Fulu school disciples, they would end up in such an awkward situation. Li Mu, a small cultivator at the 4th realm, had trapped 7 cultivators at the 5th realm in a talisman array with 18 upper-grade Earth-rank golden armor talismans and a short-distance teleportation talisman. Talisman Daozi deserved to be a genius in the Tao of talismans that was hard to come by in the last few hundred years of the talisman sect's history. This 18 heavens grand formation that was formed from 18 golden armor talismans was something he'd obtained inspiration from the 18 nether prison grand formation of the devil Tao, and he'd spent a few years of time researching it. This talisman array not only had a power equal to the 18 prison array, it also overcame the 18 prison array's weakness. The 18 prison array set up by Chu Jiang of Gojoseon required 18 ghost generals to sacrifice their lives. Moreover, their positions couldn't be moved. The 18 heavens array only required 18 golden armor talismans. The array was portable and mobile. The power of the array was related to the Fulu's grade. 18 earth high-grade Fulu could trap Dongxian. If there were 18 heaven high-grade Fulu, it wouldn't be a problem to trap a Transcendence Realm cultivator. These golden armor talismans each had their own divine arts. The 7 people in the array had to endure 18 different attacks. They complained incessantly and could only work together to create a dermic power shield. They hid within the shield and passively defended. The ghost cultivator among the 7 was King Wuguan, a subordinate of the Netherhell Saint. He also had the highest cultivation among the 7. As he used his mana to maintain the defensive shield, he observed the 18 heavenly soldiers and said, "Everyone, don't panic. The Fulu can only be maintained for a limited time. Once the spiritual energy is exhausted, it will lose its effect. As long as we hold on for a while longer, he will be at his wit's end." The 7 of them were caught off guard by the 18 heavenly soldiers. It was only then that they realized why the Heavenly Lord would place a bounty on a mere 4th realm cultivator. Although his own strength was weak, Fulu was really powerful. Cui Ming and Emperor Song deserved to die in his hands. Li Mu stood outside the array. Ever since the 7 of them gave up attacking and joined forces to resist, the situation on the battlefield had become a stalemate. Although the Fulu formation was simple and easy to carry, it also had its flaws. If the 18 Capital Heaven formation was set up by 18 Creation Realm experts, their mana would be endless. When it was exhausted, spiritual jades could be used to replenish it. The array could last for a long time. However, the Fulu's spiritual energy was limited and could not last indefinitely. The few of them joined forces to create such a protective shield. As time passed, it was possible that it could last until the Fulu's spiritual energy was exhausted. King Wuguan hid in the shield and looked at Li Mu mockingly. He said, "Emperor Song died in your hands like this. I don't believe it. Your Fulu's spiritual energy is endless. Let's see how long you can trap us." Of course, the Fulu's spiritual energy was not endless. At most, in 15 minutes, these heavenly soldiers would dissipate due to the exhaustion of their spiritual energy. Of course, Li Mu had more than one set of array talismans in his hands. Because a certain first seat really did not have anything good to give as a meeting gift, Talisman Daoist had extorted many talisman materials. Li Mu had used them to draw many Fulu formations. Just the 18 Capital Heaven formations array talismans alone was enough for him to gather 2 sets. However, Li Mu was not willing to use both sets of array talismans on these people from the demon sect. He whistled. Suddenly, something flew out of his ear. At first, it was so small that it was almost invisible. In an instant, it grew to about 10 feet tall. Li Mu whistled again. The enlarged Dao bell suddenly charged into the array formation. Under the horrified gazes of the 7 people, it fiercely slammed into the protective shield that they had conjured. When the Dao bell hit the shield, it was like an egg hitting a rock. It instantly collapsed. Puff! Among the 7 people, those with physical bodies spat out blood. Those without physical bodies had their souls dissipated. What was more serious was that without the protection of the shield, the 7 of them had to face the attacks of the 18 heavenly soldiers again. King Wuguan was already seriously injured. After the shield disappeared, he was caught off guard by a thunderbolt. His soul was even more scattered. He used the last of his spiritual energy to resist the burning of the Samadhi true fire. His face was filled with surprise. The spear he threw seemed casual, but it was actually his full-strength attack. Everything within 1,000 feet of him was turned into ruins by the recoil, but the bell was unharmed. He condensed another soul sword in his hand and slashed at the Dao bell. Dong! Another deafening sound rang out. The soul sword in the Netherhell Saint's hand dissipated, and his body was also forced back a few steps. The defense of the bell was beyond imagination. The Netherhell Saint retreated 30 meters, and countless black chi gushed out from his body. The black chi condensed into several giant pythons, which twisted their bodies and crashed into the giant bell. Dong! 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 The giant pythons dissipated when they crashed into the bell, but the giant bell remained in its original position, undamaged. Lord Netherhell's expression darkened, and he tried to attack it several more times, but it was still to no avail. The sturdiness of this bell was beyond his imagination. Even with his sixth realm power, he was actually unable to do anything to it. The recoil from the bell caused his own aura to become unstable instead. He looked at the bell again and finally discovered something. His body transformed into a ball of black chi and completely enveloped the bell. Li Mu stood inside the bell and observed the Netherhell Saint's every move. The Netherhell Saint's black chi completely enveloped the Dao bell. Li Mu didn't know what the Netherhell Saint was doing, but in the next moment, his expression changed. Wisps of black chi were seeping in from the cracks on the Dao bell. Li Mu didn't hesitate to throw out that set of array talismans again. The 18 golden armored soldiers appeared again and formed a talisman array, trapping the Dao bell and the black chi in it. One of the soldiers slashed at the black chi with his giant golden sword. Another soldier formed hand seals with both hands, and thunder exploded in the black chi. As for the other two soldiers, one transformed into a frost giant, and the other into a flame giant. They pounced at the black chi. The 18 soldiers each used their own abilities. The black chi rolled, and the Netherhell Saint appeared again. He had 2 soul swords in his hands, and one of them shattered the giant golden sword of the soldier. After withstanding several thunderbolts, the Netherhell Saint only had an unstable aura. He swung the other sword, and the frost giant and the flame giant immediately collapsed. When the 2 soldiers reformed again, their bodies were much dimmer. The great heavenly array could trap a cultivator who had just entered the 6th realm, but it was still difficult to trap a long-established expert like the Netherhell Saint. Moreover, Li Mu could see from the Dao bell that the Netherhell Saint seemed to be very effective against these divine soldiers that didn't have physical bodies. In less than 15 minutes, this talisman array would run out of spiritual power and dissipate. At this moment, Li Mu's Fulu was almost used up. He had used all his trump cards, and he had no other choice but to hide in the Dao bell. Li Mu stretched out his hand, and a jade talisman appeared in his palm. The Empress had given it to him before he left the divine capital. The Empress didn't tell Li Mu what the talisman was for. She only told him that he could crush the talisman in an emergency. Boom! At this moment, a loud sound came from outside the Dao bell. Li Mu looked outside the Dao bell and realized that the Netherhell Saint had already broken the talisman array. It was much faster than he had expected. The Netherhell Saint floated in front of the Dao bell and sized it up. He said, "This Dao bell is a good treasure, but it's a pity that it's incomplete." The Dao bell buzzed and slammed toward the Netherhell Saint. The Netherhell Saint disappeared, and the Dao bell's attack missed. When the Netherhell Saint appeared again, he was already on top of the Dao bell. He pressed his palm down, and the Dao bell was pressed to the ground. Li Mu looked up and crushed the jade talisman in his hand without hesitation. The jade talisman shattered, and it seemed like nothing had happened. However, the Netherhell Saint's expression changed. He immediately retreated a few hundred feet and looked in Li Mu's direction with vigilance. The space in front of the Dao bell fluctuated, and a figure stepped out of the void. "Your Majesty. The Empress of the Great Zhou." The voices of Li Mu and the Netherhell Saint could be heard. One was surprised, while the other was frightened. However, the latter's fear quickly turned into calmness. The Netherhell Saint looked at the illusory figure of the woman in front of him and heaved a sigh of relief. He said, "So it's just a divine clone. If your true body came, I would naturally retreat. However, a mere divine clone that has just reached the 6th stage of cultivation, what can you do to me?" The Empress looked at him indifferently and said, "You are not worthy for me to come personally." The Netherhell Saint reached into his chest and took out a pair of ghastly hook-shaped weapons. He smiled at the Empress and said, "I have long wanted to see what the Empress of the Great Zhou is capable of." As he spoke, his figure had already disappeared from where he stood. Li Mu's mind moved, and the Qingxian sword appeared in his hand. He threw the Qingxian sword forward and said, "Your Majesty, take this." The Empress stretched out her hand, and the Qingxian sword flew into her hand. She casually swung her sword, and the Nether Hell Saint's hooks appeared from the void and collided with the Qingxian sword. The ground within a radius of several hundred feet immediately collapsed. Li Mu hid in the Dao Bell and could not see the two figures. He could only feel waves of powerful magic power fluctuations. His surroundings were already in a mess because of the aftermath of the battle. Lu Yi smiled and said, "Lord Li, you just came to the yamen. If there's anything you don't understand, feel free to ask me." After seeing Lu Yi off, Li Mu sat down and used a short time to familiarize himself with the unfamiliar surroundings. Then, he began to deal with the memorials on the table. Among the 6 ministries, the Ministry of Justice had the most affairs. Especially after the law reform, the serious cases in each county had to be submitted to the Ministry of Justice for review, then to the Secretariat for review, and finally to the Empress for approval. Most of the memorials on Li Mu's table were such memorials. Human lives were at stake. Li Mu read through these reports very carefully. If there were any suspicious points or omissions, he would put them aside and wait until he went back and re-examined them. As for those that had solid evidence, they were just going through the process. They would be put aside and handed over to the Empress for her approval. There were a lot of memorials piled up in the past 3 months. Li Mu had read less than half of them from the yamen to the yamen. He picked up the last one and prepared to go home after reading it. The rest of the memorials should be finished in 2 days. Li Mu opened the memorial. This memorial was from Danyang County. It was sent by the county chief of Danyang County. In the memorial, it said that a few months ago, the county chief of Ani County of Danyang County was assassinated. Danyang County had reported this case to the Ministry of Justice several times, but there was no response. They had no choice but to submit the memorial directly to the Secretariat. Li Mu put away the memorial with a puzzled expression. The assassination of a 7th-grade official was related to the dignity of the imperial court. The death of the county chief of Anyang County had caused a huge uproar in the North County. What was the Ministry of Justice doing? Such a big thing, but they didn't report it. Lu Hanyan was supposed to sleep with Li Mu, but before the wedding, she became coy and insisted on sleeping in a different room from Li Mu, saying that she wanted to maintain the modesty of an unmarried woman. Women just like to pretend to be reserved. She had slept with him countless times in the past, and now she was lying to herself. However, Li Mu didn't have any objections. After all, they could sleep together every day in the future, and he wasn't in a hurry for half a month. After waiting for so long, this day finally came. A month later, he was also a man with a family. After being in Fairy's capital for half a year, Li Mu didn't make many friends, but made many enemies. After careful calculation, he realized that he didn't need to invite many people on the wedding day. The Fulu school had to inform them. Yu Zhenzi was equivalent to Li Mu's half-mother-in-law. She had to come when her disciple got married. As for the peak masters, it wasn't certain. They had already been exploited by Lu Hanyan and Li Mu in turns. If they came this time, they might even take out the last of their family's assets. As for the White Demon King and Xuandu, although Li Mu wanted to inform them, his two elder brothers' whereabouts were elusive. Li Mu couldn't inform them even if he wanted to. Lu Hanyan's relatives and friends in Fairy's capital were her sisters at the wonderful music bar. Li Mu didn't know many people, so a few invitations were enough. The first person Li Mu thought of was naturally the Empress. However, as the ruler of a country, it was somewhat inappropriate for her to attend the wedding of her subjects. Even if she was willing, her subjects wouldn't be willing. Therefore, when he entered the palace, he only brought 2 invitations. At the entrance of Tranquil Palace, Li Mu handed one invitation to Mr. Mei and the other to Shangguanli. He said, "My wedding is on the 9th of next month. Come to my wedding banquet if you have time. Congratulations." Sir Mei took the invitation card with a complicated look in his eyes. If she was a few years older, she would be Li Mu's mother. Now that Li Mu was about to get married, she was still alone. Shangguanli also reached out to take the invitation without saying anything, which was her usual style. Li Mu gave Mr. Mei another invitation and said, "Sister Mei, help me give one to Mrs. Chu. By the way, is Her Majesty inside?" Lord Mei glanced at him and asked, "You still want to invite His Majesty? What are you thinking? If His Majesty appears at your wedding banquet, the spittle of the courtiers during the morning court session would be enough to drown you." Li Mu shook his head and said, "Even if I can't invite Her Majesty, I still have to tell her." Mr. Mei waved his hand and said, "Go, go." Seeing Li Mu walk into Tranquil Palace, she glanced in the direction of the palace and sighed in melancholy. Li Mu walked into Tranquil Palace and saw the Empress sitting behind a table in front. Ask the Secretariat to write an edict and give her a 5th rank title. Also, give her a golden hairpin and a pair of jade bracelets. Mr. Mei saw that she had thought it through. He smiled and asked, "Your Majesty, do you feel better now?" Zhou Yi frowned. She didn't feel better. Instead, she felt even worse. She thought for a while and said, "Forget it. He is the one who is loyal to me, not his wife. Don't ask the Secretariat to write an edict." Mr. Mei paused and asked tentatively, "Then the golden hairpin and jade bracelets?" Zhou Yi thought for a while and said, "I won't give them to you either." You're tuning in to the Carefree Valley YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.